Hello, friend. Welcome back. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're settling in for sleep, taking a quiet moment after a long day, or simply curious about a story that's endured for thousands of years. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling to a place that exists both in time and imagination. A civilization so vast, so magnificent, that even its ruins whisper of grandeur. We're going to ancient Persia, to an empire that once stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edges of India, from the burning sands of Egypt to the snow-capped peaks of Central Asia. This is the story of the Achaemenid Empire, the first true superpower of the ancient world, and the civilizations that rose before and after it. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on a dusty plateau, somewhere in what we now call Iran. The year is around 550 BCE. The sun beats down mercilessly, but there's a breeze carrying the scent of distant cedar forests. Behind you, mountains rise like guardians, the Zagros Range ancient and weathered. Before you stretches a road, one of many that will soon connect an empire larger than anything the world has ever seen. You can hear the distant sound of horses, the jingle of bronze fittings, the low conversation of travelers speaking languages you've never heard. But Persia's story doesn't begin here, in this moment of imperial birth. It begins centuries earlier, with tribes of horsemen moving slowly across the Iranian plateau, carrying with them gods of fire and light, memories of distant steppes, and dreams of settlement. It begins with the Elamites, whose civilization predated even Mesopotamia's greatest cities. It begins with Cyrus, a king who would be called the Great, not just by his own people but by those he conquered. It begins with an idea, revolutionary for its time, that an empire could rule not through terror alone, but through tolerance, organization, and respect for the traditions of subject peoples. Why does this story matter? Because ancient Persia gave us concepts we still use today. The idea of human rights, codified in Cyrus's famous cylinder. The notion of a professional civil service and an efficient postal system. Religious tolerance as state policy. The image of the garden as paradise, a word that comes directly from the Persian Piri-Diza. The architectural grandeur of columned halls and elaborate reliefs. The cultural exchange that happens when diverse peoples coexist under competent administration. But more than that, Persia's story is about what it means to build something enduring. It's about the tension between conquest and compassion, between imperial ambition and cultural preservation. It's about how civilizations rise not just through military might, but through the careful management of resources, information, and human relationships. It's about what survives when empires fall, not just in ruins and artifacts, but in ideas, words, and ways of seeing the world. The Persians called their empire Exaka, which means the dominion. The Greeks called them Persians, after the region of Persis in southern Iran, though the people called themselves Iranians, Arya, meaning noble. These were people who worshipped Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of light and truth, who opposed him to Ungar Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness and lies. They believed in a cosmic struggle between order and chaos, truth and deception. A struggle reflected in their governance, their architecture, their very understanding of what it meant to rule. We're going to watch this empire emerge from tribal confederacies, reach heights of sophistication that wouldn't be matched for centuries, face challengers from Greece to Central Asia, and eventually fall to a young Macedonian king whose name you certainly know. But we're also going to see what came before, the Median Kingdom, the Elamite civilization, the mysterious origins of the Iranian peoples themselves. And we'll follow what came after, the Parthians who frustrated Rome, the Sasanians who gave Persia one last golden age before the Islamic conquest transformed the region forever. This is a story spanning more than 2,000 years, encompassing multiple civilizations, countless battles, and innovations that shaped the ancient world. It's a story of fire temples and towering columns, of royal roads and underground water channels, of poetry and administrative genius. It's the story of how a group of semi-nomadic tribes became the rulers of the known world, and how their legacy continues to echo through modern Iran, through language and literature, through architecture and art, through the very concept of empire itself. So settle in. Let the sounds of the modern world fade away. We're about to journey to the high plateaus and fertile valleys of ancient Iran, to walk through the ruins of Persepolis, to ride with Cyrus's cavalry, to stand in the throne room at Susa, to watch as Alexander's army approaches Gaugamela. We're going to explore not just the rise and fall of empires, but what it meant to be Persian, to carry the burden of greatness, to attempt the impossible task of uniting diverse peoples, to leave behind monuments that would outlast the very memory of your civilization's daily life. Now let's begin. Long before anyone called this region Persia, before the great cities rose and fell, the Iranian plateau was a place of movement and memory. Picture this landscape around 2000 BCE, a vast stretch of mountains, deserts, and valleys trapped between the Caspian Sea to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south. To the west, the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia had already risen: Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. To the east lay the mysterious Indus Valley civilization. And across this plateau, groups of people were arriving from somewhere else, bringing with them horses, bronze weapons, and a language that would give birth to modern Persian, Kurdish, and dozens of other tongues. These were the Indo-Iranian peoples, part of the same great migration that brought Indo-European speakers across much of Eurasia. They didn't arrive as conquerors with a master plan. They came in waves over centuries, some as traders, others as raiders, many simply seeking better grazing land for their herds. They moved slowly across the highlands, their world measured in the distances a horse could travel, their wealth counted in livestock, their society organized around warrior aristocracies and clan loyalties. But the plateau wasn't empty when they arrived. In the southwest, in what's now Kazakhstan, the Elamite civilization had been thriving since at least 3000 BCE. The Elamites were sophisticated, literate, urbanized people with their own writing system and a complex relationship with their Mesopotamian neighbors. Sometimes allies, sometimes conquerors, sometimes conquered. Their capital at Susa was already ancient when the first Iranian tribes appeared on the plateau's edges. The Elamites built ziggurats like the Mesopotamians, kept detailed administrative records, worked bronze and gold with remarkable skill, and worshipped gods whose names we still know: in Shushanak, Humban, Kururisha. The meeting between these settled, urban Elamites and the incoming Iranian pastoralists wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a long, complex process of integration, conflict, and cultural exchange spanning centuries. The Iranians learned from the Elamites, they adopted elements of their administrative systems, were influenced by their art, and eventually even made Susa one of their own capitals. But they also maintained their distinct identity, their own religious traditions, their warrior culture and clan structures. By around 1000 BCE, we can begin to distinguish two main Iranian groups on the plateau: the Medes in the northwest and the Persians in the southwest. Both spoke related Iranian languages. Both had similar social structures, religious beliefs, and material cultures. But geography shaped them differently. The Medes occupied the region around modern Hamadan, closer to Mesopotamia and Anatolia, more exposed to the political currents of the ancient Near East. The Persians settled in Persis, modern Fars province, a region of mountains and valleys that protected them while also limiting their initial expansion. These early Iranian societies were stratified but relatively fluid. At the top stood warrior nobles, men who could afford horses, bronze armor, and the training to use them effectively in battle. Below them came free farmers and herders, people who owned land or livestock and could bear arms when needed. At the bottom were servants and possibly slaves, though slavery never became as central to Iranian society as it was to Greece or Rome. This structure was held together by concepts of personal loyalty and honor, by shared religious practices, and by the practical need for mutual defense in a sometimes harsh environment. Their religion was already taking the form that would later be systematized by the prophet Zoroaster. They worshipped Ahuras, mighty gods or lords, and opposed them to devas, demonic forces of chaos. But whether Cyrus actually grew up as a shepherd or was raised in his father's palace, what matters is that by the time he came to power around 559 BCE, he had already become a figure around whom legends gathered. He was seen as special, as chosen, as destined for greatness. And he would not disappoint those expectations. Cyrus the Great, as history would remember him, inherited a small kingdom in 559 BCE. Persis was prosperous enough, protected by mountains, home to hardy people and excellent horses. But it was still subordinate to Media, still overshadowed by its powerful northern neighbor. What Cyrus did with this inheritance would create the template for empire that would last for centuries. We don't know exactly what sparked the break between Cyrus and his Median overlord Astyages. Ancient sources tell different stories: personal ambition, Median weakness, Astyages' paranoia, or perhaps simply the natural tension between a vigorous young king and an aging overlord. What we know is that around 553 BCE Cyrus rebelled, and in a development that must have shocked everyone, significant portions of the Median army defected to him. This wasn't simply military success. It revealed Cyrus's genius for understanding human motivation. Rather than presenting himself as a Persian nationalist seeking to overthrow foreign rule, he positioned himself as the legitimate heir to both Persian and Median traditions, a unifier rather than a destroyer. Median nobles who felt threatened or sidelined by Astyages saw in Cyrus not an enemy but an alternative. When the decisive battle came, possibly at Pasargadae in Persis, the Median king found himself abandoned by his own troops. By 550 BCE, Cyrus had taken Ecbatana and incorporated the Median kingdom into his own. But here's what's remarkable. He didn't destroy the Median aristocracy or reduce their cities to rubble. Instead, he kept Median nobles in positions of authority, maintained Ecbatana as one of his capitals, and presented the union of Media and Persia as a partnership. The Greeks would later refer to the Persians as the Medes, a confusion that reveals how successfully Cyrus integrated the two peoples. This pattern of conquest through incorporation would define Cyrus's entire reign. His empire grew not just through military victory, but through a sophisticated understanding of how to make conquest palatable. He studied the weaknesses and internal divisions of his targets. He presented himself not as a foreign destroyer, but as a liberator from tyranny or chaos. He preserved local customs, religious practices, and social structures. And he was ruthlessly efficient in organizing what he conquered. After Media came Lydia, the wealthy kingdom in western Anatolia ruled by King Croesus, a man so rich his name became synonymous with wealth. Croesus, worried about the rising Persian power, consulted the oracle at Delphi, who told him that if he attacked Cyrus, a great empire would fall. He attacked. An empire did fall, his own. By 547 BCE, Lydia was Persian territory, and Cyrus controlled the Greek cities along the Anatolian coast. But it was in Babylon that Cyrus's approach reached its full expression. Babylon in the 540s BCE was ancient even then, a city of temples and gardens, of accumulated wisdom and wealth. It was ruled by Nabonidus, a king more interested in archaeology and religion than governance, who had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. When Cyrus approached with his army in 539 BCE, he didn't come as a destroyer. He came as Marduk's chosen instrument to restore proper religious practice. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879, tells the story from the conqueror's perspective. It's a clay barrel inscribed with Akkadian cuneiform, and it presents Cyrus as a pious ruler correcting Nabonidus's mistakes. He claims to have entered Babylon peacefully, restored the temples, returned sacred images to their proper cities, and freed people who had been held in servitude. He presents himself not as a Persian king imposing foreign rule, but as a legitimate Mesopotamian ruler in the ancient tradition. How much of this was genuine belief and how much calculated propaganda is impossible to say. Probably both. Cyrus seems to have genuinely believed that the gods of conquered peoples, or rather, that the single divine order he worshipped had chosen him to rule. And he understood that empires built on terror and destruction are expensive to maintain and quick to rebel. Better to rule through consent where possible, through administrative efficiency rather than garrison troops. This is where the famous Persian tolerance originated, not necessarily from philosophical commitment to pluralism, but from pragmatic recognition that diverse peoples are easier to govern when you respect their traditions. The Jews, exiled in Babylon since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem, were allowed to return home and rebuild their temple. The Cyrus cylinder's declaration of religious freedom, while self-serving, represents one of history's first codifications of such a principle. But tolerance shouldn't be confused with weakness. Cyrus's empire was built on military might and organized with military precision. The core of his army came from the Iranian peoples, Medes, Persians, and other related tribes, skilled horsemen and archers who formed the mobile striking force. He incorporated infantry from conquered territories, creating mixed units that could adapt to different terrain and enemies. He maintained supply lines with ruthless efficiency, understanding that armies without food quickly become mobs. The empire's organization was equally sophisticated. Cyrus divided his territory. Water management became a Persian specialty, essential in a region where rainfall was unpredictable. They perfected the Khanate system, underground channels that brought water from mountain sources to fields and cities without significant loss to evaporation. These remarkable engineering works, some dozens of kilometers long, required precise calculation of gradients and extraordinary labor to construct. Many built during the Achaemenid period function even today. Cyrus died in 530 BCE, killed while campaigning against nomadic tribes in Central Asia. The sources disagree about the exact circumstances. Some say he fell in battle against the Massagetæ and their warrior queen Tamaris. Others suggest different enemies or different fates. What matters is that he died while still expanding his empire, while still demonstrating the restless energy that had carried him from a small kingdom in Persis to rule over most of the known world. He left behind something unprecedented. An empire stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, from Egypt to Central Asia. He left a system of government flexible enough to accommodate diverse peoples while maintaining central control. He left a military machine capable of projecting power across enormous distances. And he left an idea that empire could be based not just on conquest but on organization, not just on terror but on at least a degree of respect for the conquered. His son Cambyses II would expand the empire further, conquering Egypt. His successor Darius would systematize everything Cyrus began, creating the administrative and economic structures that would sustain the empire for 2 centuries. But the foundation was Cyrus's, and the Persians knew it. They called him father. They remembered him as the founder, and long after the empire fell, his name remained synonymous with just kingship. When Cambyses II succeeded his father in 530 BCE, he inherited an empire that was magnificent but fragile. The size was unprecedented. Its diversity was almost unmanageable, and its very success had created new problems. How do you govern territories that speak dozens of languages, worship hundreds of gods, and follow customs that sometimes directly contradict each other? Cambyses would expand the empire further by conquering Egypt, but it would fall to Darius I to truly consolidate Persian power and create the structures that would define the Achaemenid Empire for generations. Cambyses's reign was relatively short and is remembered today primarily for 2 things: the conquest of Egypt and the mysterious circumstances of his death. He marched into Egypt in 525 BCE and defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at Pelusium, adding the ancient Nile civilization to Persia's already impressive collection of conquered peoples. Unlike his father, Cambyses developed a reputation for harshness, particularly regarding Egyptian religion. Later sources, mostly Greek and mostly hostile, accuse him of desecrating temples and killing the sacred Apis bull, though these accounts may be exaggerations or fabrications designed to justify later rebellion. What we know for certain is that while Cambyses was in Egypt, a rebellion broke out in the Persian heartland. A man claiming to be Bardia, Cambyses's younger brother, seized the throne. Cambyses died while rushing back to deal with this crisis. Some sources say by accident, others by suicide, still others by assassination. And the empire, just 8 years after Cyrus's death, stood on the brink of disintegration. This is where Darius enters our story. Darius was a distant cousin of Cyrus, a nobleman from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid dynasty. He was serving as a spear-bearer, essentially a bodyguard, to Cambyses when the king died. What happened next is told primarily from Darius's own perspective, carved in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, on the face of a cliff at Behistun, high above the royal road in western Iran. According to Darius's account, the man ruling as Bardia was actually an impostor, a Median priest named Gaumeda who had murdered the real Bardia months earlier. Darius, along with 6 other Persian nobles, discovered the deception and assassinated the false king. Darius was then chosen as the new king, his legitimacy established through his Achaemenid blood and his service to Cyrus and Cambyses. Whether this is the truth or an elaborate justification for what was essentially a coup is something historians still debate. What's certain is that Darius's claim to the throne was immediately challenged. The empire exploded into rebellion. Babylon revolted twice. Media rose up. Elam rejected Persian rule. Egypt prepared for independence. Provinces across the empire saw this moment of transition as an opportunity to break free. Darius spent the next 2 years crushing these rebellions with extraordinary energy and ruthlessness. The Behistun inscription lists 19 battles, though the actual number was probably higher. He personally led armies across the empire, demonstrating both military skill and political acumen. He didn't just defeat rebels. He made examples of rebel leaders while offering amnesty to their followers. He executed the pretender kings but integrated their armies into his own. He moved with such speed that rebel provinces often found themselves facing Persian armies before they had fully organized their resistance. By 519 BCE, order had been restored. But Darius understood that simply suppressing rebellion wasn't enough. The empire needed systematic reform, needed structures that would make future challenges less likely and less dangerous. So he set about creating what would become the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world had yet seen. Darius formalized the satrapy system that Cyrus had begun. He divided the empire into around 23 provinces, each with clearly defined boundaries and responsibilities. Each satrap was essentially a king in his own province, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, raising troops when needed, and administering justice. But Darius created checks on their power. He appointed separate military commanders who reported directly to the king. He sent out inspectors called the King's Eyes and Ears to monitor the satrapies and report any hint of disloyalty or incompetence. He required regular tribute and regular reports. The tax system was revolutionized. Rather than the somewhat haphazard collection methods of earlier reigns, Darius established fixed tribute amounts for each satrapy based on careful assessment of their agricultural productivity, natural resources, and trade wealth. The amounts were substantial but not crushing. Darius understood that overtaxation breeds rebellion. Some provinces paid in gold, others in silver, still others in goods or services. India sent gold dust. Babylon provided enormous quantities of grain. Ethiopia sent ivory and ebony. The horse-breeding regions of Media supplied cavalry mounts. This tribute flowed toward 3 main capitals: Persepolis in Persis, Susa in Elam, and Ecbatana in Media. The king moved between these cities according to the season: winter in Susa, where the climate was mild; summer in Ecbatana in the cool mountains; spring in Persepolis for the New Year celebration. This mobile court meant that different regions felt the presence of royal power directly, and it prevented any single city from becoming so dominant that it could challenge the king. Darius also standardized the currency, introducing the daric, named after himself, and the siglos, gold and silver coins of reliable weight and purity that facilitated trade across the empire. He established standardized weights and measures. He created an efficient legal system where local laws were respected but could be appealed to royal judges. He built or improved roads, dug canals, and sponsored exploration. He sent an expedition to explore the Indus River and another to circumnavigate Africa. But perhaps Darius's most impressive achievement was the construction of Persepolis. Cyrus had built a capital at Pasargadae, a city of gardens and simple elegance. Darius wanted something more, a statement of imperial power and glory that would literally elevate the king above all others. On a massive terrace carved from the mountain itself, he began building a ceremonial complex of such scale and ambition that it wouldn't be completed until the reign of his grandson Xerxes. Persepolis wasn't primarily a city where people lived and worked. Susa and Ecbatana served those functions better. Instead, it was a stage for the most important ritual of the Persian year, Nowruz, the New Year celebration. Every spring, delegations from all the empire's provinces would climb the grand staircase. This wasn't cynical pragmatism, or at least not entirely. For Darius and the Persian elite, Ahura Mazda was the supreme god, but that didn't mean other gods didn't exist or weren't worthy of respect. The Zoroastrian conception of truth, Arta in Persian, encompassed both religious devotion and proper fulfillment of one's social role. For a conquered people to worship their traditional gods properly was part of maintaining Arta, part of keeping the cosmic order. The military was reorganized into a professional force supplemented by provincial levies. At its core stood the Immortals, an elite unit of 10,000 infantry always maintained at full strength. When a man fell, he was immediately replaced, making the unit symbolically immortal. These were the best equipped, best trained troops in the army, bodyguards to the king and shock troops in battle. Around them were organized the cavalry, horse archers who could ride and shoot with devastating accuracy, and infantry drawn from across the empire, each unit maintaining its traditional weapons and fighting style but integrated into a larger tactical system. By 518 BCE, Darius had extended the empire even further, conquering parts of India and establishing control over Thrace in southeastern Europe. The Persian Empire now stretched from the Indus to the Danube, from the Hindu Kush to the Nile. It encompassed perhaps 50 million people, about 44% of the world's population at the time. It was the largest empire ever assembled, administered with a sophistication that wouldn't be matched until Rome, and sustained by systems of organization that in some ways weren't surpassed until the modern era. Darius had done what seemed impossible, taken an empire built by conquest and given it structures that could sustain it. He had created institutions that balanced central control with local autonomy, that generated enormous wealth without crushing the provinces, that maintained order without requiring constant military presence. He had built monuments that declared Persian power while incorporating the artistic traditions of subject peoples. He had established himself not just as a conqueror but as a legitimate king in the eyes of dozens of different cultures. The Achaemenid Empire, in the form Darius gave it, would last for another 2 centuries. It would face challenges and crises, would lose territories and reconquer them, would produce both strong kings and weak ones. But the basic structures Darius established, the satrapies, the tribute system, the road network, the ceremonial centers, the balance between unity and diversity, these would endure. And as Darius looked out from Persepolis over the empire he had secured, as he sat in state receiving tribute from peoples stretching from the Aegean to India, he might have been forgiven for believing that what he had built would last forever. Under Darius' I and his successor Xerxes' I, the Achaemenid Empire entered its golden age. This was the period when Persian culture reached its fullest expression, when the administrative systems hummed with efficiency, when wealth flowed from provinces to capitals and transformed them into architectural wonders. This was when being Persian meant belonging to a civilization that saw itself as the pinnacle of human achievement, the culmination of all previous empires, the final and permanent ordering of the world. Imagine Persepolis on the morning of Nowruz around 480 BCE. The dawn light catches the eastern face of the terrace, illuminating the limestone reliefs that line the staircases. Delegates from 23 satrapies are already gathering, Babylonians in embroidered robes, Egyptians with linen kilts, Indians with cotton garments, Greeks from Ionia in their characteristic cloaks, Scythians in leather and fur, Ethiopians with elephant tusks, Bactrians leading Bactrian camels, Armenians with fine horses. Each delegation carries tribute. Gold and silver vessels, precious fabrics, weapons of exquisite craftsmanship, exotic animals, rare spices, but luxury didn't mean softness. Persian nobles were expected to be warriors, administrators, and landowners simultaneously. Boys of good families were educated in what Herodotus tells us were 3 skills: riding horses, shooting bows, and speaking the truth. Physical fitness was essential. Nobles hunted lions and wild boars, practiced archery and swordsmanship, competed in races and wrestling. The king himself was expected to be the best horseman, the finest archer, the most courageous hunter. This culture of martial aristocracy created a peculiar relationship between the Persian elite and the peoples they ruled. Unlike later European colonial powers, the Persians didn't see subject peoples as inherently inferior. Rather, they saw them as lacking the particular virtues that made Persians excellent: the combination of martial prowess, administrative competence, and devotion to truth. A Greek could become wealthy and influential serving the Persian king, though he couldn't become Persian. An Egyptian priest could maintain his temple and his dignity under Persian rule. A Jewish official could rise high in the imperial administration. The economy during this period generated wealth on a scale difficult to comprehend. The royal treasuries at Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana held thousands of talents of gold and silver, perhaps equivalent to billions of dollars in modern terms. This wasn't just hoarded wealth. It circulated through the empire as the king paid his soldiers, supported temples, funded building projects, and rewarded loyal subjects. A successful merchant could become wealthy trading between provinces. A skilled craftsman working on royal projects could support a large household. Agriculture supported everything. The Khanate systems brought water to fields that would otherwise have been desert. Farmers grew wheat and barley, tended date palms and fruit orchards, raised sheep and cattle. The empire's agricultural surplus was substantial enough to support not just the royal court and military, but also a growing class of urban craftsmen, merchants, and administrators. Trade routes crisscrossed the empire, protected by the king's peace and facilitated by standardized currency and weights. Caravans carried Chinese silk, already reaching Persia by this time, Indian spices, frankincense from Arabia, Egyptian papyrus, Tyrian purple dye, Lydian textiles. Merchants grew wealthy on the margins, and cities along the trade routes prospered. The royal road wasn't just for military communication. It was a commercial highway that knitted the empire together economically as much as politically. The arts flourished under royal patronage. Persian goldsmiths produced jewelry of extraordinary delicacy. Gold pomegranates and vessels, intricate filigree work, combinations of precious stones and metals. Stone carvers created reliefs that covered the walls of Persepolis and other palaces, showing not just tribute bearers and military victories, but also hunts, garden scenes, and symbolic representations of kingship. These reliefs had a distinctive Persian style, formal, balanced, emphasizing pattern and repetition but with enough variation to remain interesting. Architecture blended influences from across the empire while remaining distinctively Persian. The columned halls recalled Egypt, but the columns themselves were uniquely Persian. Slender, tall, but empires, no matter how magnificent, are never as permanent as they appear from inside. Let's slow down for a moment and examine how this enormous machine actually worked. How did messages travel from Persepolis to the satrap in Bactria, thousands of kilometers away? How did the empire know what was happening in Egypt or Ionia? How were taxes collected from people speaking dozens of languages, using different currencies, measuring in different units? How did Persian rule function day to day, beyond the ceremonial grandeur and military power? The answer lies in systems, sophisticated, interconnected systems that represented perhaps the Achaemenid Empire's greatest achievement. These weren't improvised or accidental. They were designed, refined, and maintained with the same attention to detail that went into the reliefs at Persepolis. Start with communication. The royal road network extended over 2,500 kilometers, with stations every 25 to 30 kilometers, about a day's hard ride. At each station, fresh horses and riders waited. When a message needed to travel from the king to a distant satrap, it was carried in relay, each rider covering his section at maximum speed before passing the message to the next. Herodotus marveled at this system. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents them from completing their appointed rounds as swiftly as possible. These weren't ordinary messengers. They were royal officials, part of an elaborate bureaucracy that kept the empire's administration flowing. They carried sealed messages bearing the royal seal. Breaking that seal without authorization meant death. They had authority to requisition supplies and fresh horses. They were the nervous system of the empire, carrying commands, reports, warnings, and updates in a constant flow of information that allowed central authority to respond to distant events with unprecedented speed. The roads themselves were engineering marvels. The main routes were paved, drained, and maintained by local authorities under royal supervision. Bridges crossed rivers. Way stations provided shelter, food, and fresh animals. Guards protected travelers from bandits. Milestones marked distances. These roads served military purposes. Troops could move quickly to trouble spots, but they also facilitated trade, pilgrimage, and the general movement of people and ideas that knitted the empire together culturally as well as administratively. Now consider how taxes worked. Each satrapy owed a fixed annual tribute, assessed by Darius based on careful surveys of agricultural land, mineral resources, and commercial activity. The amounts were substantial. Babylon alone owed 1,000 talents of silver annually, equivalent to the value of perhaps 30,000 kilograms of silver. But collection was organized to minimize disruption to local economies. The satrap was responsible for collecting the tribute, but he didn't personally go farm to farm demanding payment. Instead, he worked through existing local authorities, city councils, temple administrators, tribal leaders, whoever actually controlled land and labor in each region. These local elites collected taxes from their subjects using whatever methods they traditionally used, then forwarded an agreed portion to the satrap. This system meant that ordinary farmers often didn't interact directly with Persian authority at all. They paid taxes to the same. Logistics made these large armies possible. The empire maintained supply depots along major routes, stockpiling grain and other essentials. Armies on campaign requisitioned supplies from local populations, but with careful records. Theoretically, at least, communities would be compensated for what was taken. Transport ships moved supplies along rivers and coasts. The organizational capacity to feed and supply armies of tens of thousands for months at a time was itself a military advantage. Now let's talk about the Magi, the priestly class that maintained religious life across the empire. They weren't exactly priests in the way we might understand the term. They were ritual specialists, interpreters of dreams and omens, keepers of religious knowledge. They tended the fire temples, performed sacrifices, maintained calendar calculations, and advised nobles on religious matters. The Magi preserved oral traditions that would eventually be written down as the Avesta, the Zoroastrian scriptures. They memorized hymns and liturgies, passed down from generation to generation with careful attention to preserving exact wording. They maintained complex rituals for maintaining purity, avoiding pollution from dead bodies, keeping fire from contact with impure substances, performing ablutions and prayers at specified times. But they also adapted to local conditions. In Babylon, they worked alongside priests of Marduk. In Egypt, they coexisted with the ancient priesthoods of the temples along the Nile. In practice, the Magi functioned as a literate administrative class as much as a purely religious one. They could read and write, they understood record-keeping, they had education that made them valuable to the imperial bureaucracy. The palace complexes themselves were administrative centers as much as royal residences. At Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana, thousands of officials worked in archives, treasuries, and administrative offices. They kept records in multiple languages: Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian, Aramaic, depending on the document's purpose and audience. Clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and parchment preserved everything from tax receipts to royal proclamations, from supply requisitions to diplomatic correspondence. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, discovered by archaeologists, gives us a window into this bureaucratic world. These clay tablets, about 30,000 of them, are mostly administrative records from the reign of Darius. Rations issued to workers, supplies moved between locations, payments made for various services. They're mundane documents, but they reveal an administration that tracked resources with remarkable precision. For example, one tablet records rations of grain and wine issued to a group of workers, men, women, and children, traveling from one location to another. It specifies the amounts given based on gender and age, notes who authorized the payment, and records the date. Multiply this single transaction by thousands occurring daily across the empire, and you get a sense of the administrative apparatus required to keep everything functioning. Women appear regularly in these records, which surprises many people who assume ancient Near Eastern societies completely excluded women from economic life. The tablets show women receiving wages for their work, managing estates, traveling on official business. The empire also needed skilled workers in enormous numbers. Stone carvers to create the reliefs at Persepolis came from across the empire: Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, each bringing their technical skills, but working within a distinctively Persian aesthetic. Architects and engineers designed the great buildings, calculated load-bearing requirements, organized construction projects. Scribes maintained the archives. Translators facilitated communication between officials speaking different languages. Artisans produced everything from royal regalia to everyday tools. These workers weren't slaves, at least not in most cases. They were paid wages, recorded carefully in the administrative tablets, and could move between projects. Many were specialists who traveled to wherever their skills were needed, following royal construction projects around the empire. This created a class of skilled professionals whose loyalty was to their craft and their employers rather than to any particular city or region. The banking and credit systems were surprisingly sophisticated. Wealthy families and temples functioned essentially as banks, accepting deposits, making loans, and facilitating money transfers across the empire. The Murashu family in Babylon, for example, left archives showing they loaned money to farmers, leased land, collected rents, and handled financial transactions for clients across several provinces. They charged interest, kept detailed records, and apparently prospered under Persian rule. Contracts were written, witnessed, and sealed. If a merchant in Babylon needed to pay a supplier in Sardis, he could deposit silver with a banker in Babylon and receive a document guaranteeing payment in Sardis, an early form of check or letter of credit. This system reduced the need to physically transport precious metals, making long-distance trade safer and more efficient. Education for elite children combined practical skills with moral instruction. Boys learned to ride horses starting at an early age. Riding was considered essential for any proper Persian. They practiced archery until they could shoot accurately from horseback at a gallop. They studied the histories and traditions of their families, memorizing genealogies and the deeds of ancestors. They learned to speak truth, arta, which meant not just literal honesty but fulfilling one's proper role, maintaining one's honor, and contributing to social order. Girls of elite families received different but not necessarily inferior education. They learned household management, which in wealthy families meant supervising servants, managing estates, and handling financial matters. They learned weaving and other textile arts. Persian carpets and tapestries were already famous, and creating them was considered honorable work even for noble women. They might learn to read and write, though this was less universal than for boys. And they learned the social skills needed to manage a large household and navigate court life if their families rose to prominence. Medical knowledge combined practical observation with religious interpretation. Persian physicians could set bones, treat wounds, perform some surgeries, and compound medicines from herbs and minerals. But they also understood health in religious terms, disease as a form of pollution or as punishment for moral failings. The Magi performed purification rituals for the sick, while physicians provided practical treatment. Often the same person combined both roles. The Persians had inherited medical knowledge from the Babylonians and Egyptians, and they added their own observations. They understood something of anatomy from treating battle wounds. They knew herbs that could reduce fever, ease pain, or purge the digestive system. They used wine as an antiseptic. Their success rate by modern standards was certainly limited, but for the ancient world, Persian medicine was reasonably advanced. Now consider the coordination required for a major royal ceremony like Nowruz. Months in advance, messages went out to all the satrapies specifying when and where delegations should arrive. Each satrap organized his delegation, choosing representatives, collecting tribute, arranging transport and supplies for the journey. The delegations traveled along the royal roads, sometimes for weeks, staying at way stations, presenting credentials to local officials, gradually converging on Persepolis. Meanwhile, at Persepolis itself, preparations intensified. Workers cleaned and decorated the buildings. Supply officers stockpiled food and drink for the thousands of visitors. Security forces arrived to maintain order. Scribes prepared to record the tribute and any other official business. The king's household staff ensured everything was ready for the royal presence. Musicians and performers prepared entertainment. Priests readied the fire temples for the ceremonies. When the delegations arrived, they were housed according to their rank. Important satraps in better accommodations, lesser officials in more modest quarters. Daily, they participated in ceremonies, meetings, and informal gatherings that reinforced relationships and conducted empire business. Scribes recorded everything. The tribute was catalogued, stored, or redistributed. Disputes were mediated. Appointments were announced. And through it all, the Persian elite demonstrated their power, wealth, and organizational sophistication. This was how the empire actually worked, day by day, year by year, through systems that touched every aspect of life, from the tax collector visiting a farming village to the courier galloping along the royal road, from the scribe recording grain allocations to the satrap administering justice, from the magi tending fire temples to the banker facilitating trade. These systems were the empire's true foundation, more important in the long run than any battle or any king. They also generated enormous documentation, most of which is lost. Fire destroyed the wooden structures that housed archives. Clay tablets were discarded when their information became outdated. Papyrus and parchment deteriorated in all but the driest climates. What survives, the Persepolis tablets, inscriptions on stone, occasional documents preserved by chance, represents a tiny fraction of what once existed. But even these fragments reveal an empire that was, in its way, remarkably modern. It understood information management. It recognized the importance of infrastructure. It developed professional civil service. It created systems that could function even when individual officials were incompetent or corrupt. It balanced central control with local. The Achaemenid Empire's genius wasn't just in conquering territory. It was in creating systems that could govern that territory efficiently, extract resources without destroying productivity, maintain order without requiring constant military presence, and coordinate activity across vast distances and cultural differences. These systems, refined over decades, made the empire's golden age possible and sustainable. The year 480 BC represents, in many ways, the absolute peak of Achaemenid power. Xerxes I, son of Darius, sits on the throne. The empire has never been larger or wealthier. The administrative systems function smoothly. The provinces are prosperous and, with minor exceptions, peaceful. The royal treasuries overflow with gold and silver. And Xerxes is about to lead the largest military expedition in ancient history to complete what his father began, the conquest of Greece. From the Persian perspective, Greece wasn't particularly important. The Greek cities of Ionia on the western coast of Anatolia were already Persian subjects, wealthy and reasonably content under Persian rule. Mainland Greece, those fractious city-states across the Aegean, represented more of an irritation than a serious threat. They had supported a rebellion in Ionia a few years earlier, even sending troops to burn Sardis, the satrapy capital. Darius had launched a punitive expedition in 490 BCE, which had ended badly at Marathon when Athenian hoplites defeated the Persian force. But this wasn't really about Greece. It was about completing the empire, bringing its western boundary to what the Persians considered its natural conclusion, the edge of the known world. It was about avenging the insult of Marathon. It was about demonstrating that Persian power was absolute, that resistance was futile, that the empire's enemies would eventually face consequences. And perhaps, for Xerxes personally, it was about stepping out of his father's shadow and proving himself worthy of the throne. The expedition Xerxes assembled was staggering in scale. Ancient sources give wildly exaggerated numbers. Herodotus claims over 2 million troops, which is demographically impossible. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 150,000 to 250,000 soldiers, which was still by far the largest army the ancient world had yet seen. This force included contingents from across the empire, Persian and Median cavalry and infantry forming the core, Egyptian marines, Phoenician ships, Indian archers, Bactrian horsemen, Ethiopian spearmen, Ionian Greeks fighting for their Persian overlord. The logistics of moving such a force across Anatolia required years of preparation. Supply depots were established along the route. Bridges were built across rivers. Ships were assembled. Perhaps 600 to 700 warships plus hundreds of transport vessels. A canal was even dug across the Athos Peninsula to avoid the dangerous waters where a previous Persian fleet had been wrecked. This canal, about 2 kilometers long and wide enough for 2 triremes to pass, represented an engineering achievement that awed contemporaries. When the army and fleet finally moved in 480 BCE, it must have seemed unstoppable. They crossed from Asia to Europe on pontoon bridges built across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating the continents. Herodotus describes these bridges as marvels of engineering. Hundreds of ships lashed together, planks laid across them, earth spread over the planks to create a roadway, fences erected along the sides so horses wouldn't panic at the sight of water. It took 7 days for the entire force to cross. The Persian advance through Thrace and Macedonia was essentially a victory march. The northern Greeks either submitted or fled. Only when the army reached central Greece did it meet serious resistance. At Thermopylae, in the narrow coastal pass, a small Greek force led by Spartan king Leonidas held the Persians for several days before being outflanked and destroyed. The battle became legendary in Greek memory, 300 Spartans plus several thousand other Greeks, dying to the last man. But from the Persian perspective, Thermopylae was a minor delay, not a serious defeat. The army continued south, entering Athens to find it abandoned. The city was burned, partly in revenge for Sardis, partly as a warning. The Persian fleet defeated the Greek fleet at Artemisium. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Victory seemed assured. Then came Salamis. The Greek fleet, outnumbered but fighting in narrow waters that negated the Persian numerical advantage, destroyed a large portion of the Persian navy. The tactical details matter less than the strategic result. Xerxes, suddenly uncertain about maintaining his supply lines with the fleet weakened, decided to return to Asia with much of his army, leaving a force under General Mardonius to complete the conquest. The following year, at Plataea, the remaining Persian army was defeated by a Greek coalition. Mardonius was killed. The Persians retreated from Greece, their expansion westward permanently halted. This is usually presented as a turning point, the beginning of Persian decline. But that's a Greek perspective shaped by the fact that Greek civilization would eventually, through Alexander, conquer the Persian Empire. From the Persian viewpoint at the time, the Greek campaign was a setback but hardly catastrophic. Greece was a peripheral concern. The empire remained intact. The provinces still paid tribute. The administrative systems still functioned. Life in Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana continued much as before. In fact, the mid-5th century BCE, after the Greek Wars, represents in many ways the empire's most stable and prosperous period. The borders were secure. No major external threats presented themselves. The economy was strong, trade flourished, agriculture produced consistent surpluses, the cities grew. Art and architecture reached their full development. Xerxes completed much of Persepolis's construction, creating the complex whose ruins still impress visitors today. Daily life across the empire during this period followed patterns that had become well established. In the agricultural heartlands, the plains of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the valleys of the Iranian plateau, farmers worked land their families had farmed for generations. They used bronze tools, iron was known but not yet dominant in the region, ox-drawn plows, and irrigation systems maintained by community labor. They paid taxes to local authorities, who forwarded portions to the satrap, who sent tribute to the king. Most years, this system worked well enough that farmers could feed their families and have surplus to trade. In the cities, the Persian elite lived in remarkable comfort. Their estates produced wealth from agriculture and trade. They maintained households with dozens or hundreds of servants. They traveled between properties, conducting business and enjoying leisure. They hunted in royal parks, which were stocked with lions, deer, and other game. They attended court when summoned, participated in ceremonial occasions, and maintained the social networks that translated into influence and opportunity. Persian gardens, Paradisa, the origin of our word paradise, reached their full development during this period. These weren't wild natural spaces but carefully designed geometric layouts. Walls enclosed them, providing privacy and protection. Water channels divided the space into quadrants, representing the 4 rivers of the mythical paradise. Trees provided shade, cypresses, planes, fruit trees arranged in ordered rows. Pavilions offered places to rest, to receive guests, to escape the heat. Flowers and herbs filled the beds. Roses, tulips, jasmine, narcissus. These gardens represented the Persian ideal of civilized space, nature controlled, ordered, made beautiful and useful. Persian art during this period maintained the style established under Darius while reaching new levels of refinement. The reliefs at Persepolis show processions, tribute bearers, throne scenes, hunting scenes, all rendered with formal balance and attention to detail. The figures are shown in profile, but with both eyes visible, in a convention borrowed from Egyptian art but made distinctively Persian. Clothing and jewelry are carefully depicted, making these reliefs valuable sources for understanding Persian material culture. Metalwork reached extraordinary sophistication. Gold and silver vessels, raita shaped like animal heads, bowls with intricate repoussé decoration, jewelry combining precious metals with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise, demonstrated both technical skill and aesthetic refinement. Much of this work combined Persian forms with decorative elements borrowed from across the empire, creating a style that was cosmopolitan while remaining distinctively Persian. The Zoroastrian religion continued to develop during this period, though we must be careful not to read later orthodoxy back into this time. Fire temples became more elaborate and more numerous. The priesthood became more organized. But religious practice remained somewhat flexible, and the sharp dualism of later Zoroastrianism, the absolute opposition of good and evil, light and darkness, was still emerging. Persian kings continued to present themselves as chosen by Ahura Mazda to maintain order and justice. Royal inscriptions invoke the god's name and credit him with victories. But they also show the king actively participating in this cosmic struggle, not simply as God's passive instrument, but as an active agent in maintaining order against chaos and lies. This gave Persian kingship a moral dimension. The king was supposed to be just truthful and devoted to order, not simply powerful. How well individual kings lived up to this ideal varied. Xerxes seems to have been competent but not exceptional. His son Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 424 BCE, maintained the empire effectively without attempting major new conquests. He dealt with a serious rebellion in Egypt by reconquering the province. He ended the conflict with Greece through a peace treaty that essentially acknowledged the status quo: Persian control of Anatolia, Greek independence in the Aegean. This was the empire at its pinnacle, not dramatically expanding, not facing existential threats, simply functioning as it had been designed to function. The systems hummed along. Tribute flowed in, royal expenditures flowed out. The army deterred threats without needing to be constantly deployed. The provinces prospered under light-handed administration. The elite enjoyed the fruits of empire. The great ceremonial centers at Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana hosted annual gatherings that reinforced relationships and demonstrated power. For someone living in, say, 450 BCE, in any of the empire's major cities, the Achaemenid order must have seemed permanent. It had existed for a century, through multiple generations. Its structures were well established. Its power was undeniable. Its wealth was visible everywhere. The idea that it might someday fall, that some future conqueror might burn Persepolis and scatter its people, would have seemed absurd. And yet, even at this moment of apparent stability and strength, the seeds of future troubles were present. The very size of the empire made it difficult to govern effectively when kings were weak or distracted. The satrapy system, which worked well when satraps were loyal and competent, could become problematic when powerful satraps began acting semi-independently. The military system, which relied on integrating diverse provincial troops, required constant attention to maintain effectiveness. And the empire's wealth, concentrated in royal treasuries, created temptations for ambitious officials and potential usurpers. But these were potential problems, not immediate crises. For now, the Achaemenid Empire stood at the pinnacle of ancient power, wealthy, organized, culturally sophisticated, and seemingly invincible. But the episode revealed something troubling. A provincial governor, admittedly one of the most powerful, had been able to raise a substantial army and march it deep into the empire before being stopped. And he had attracted significant Persian support, suggesting that loyalty to the ruling king was not automatic or universal. The Greeks who fought for Cyrus, hired with silver from his province's treasuries, proved disciplined and effective even in defeat. They fought their way back to the Black Sea coast in safety, writing a famous account of their adventures that would inspire later Greek ambitions. Egypt provided another warning sign. The wealthy Nile Valley had never been entirely comfortable under Persian rule. Egyptian civilization was ancient when the Persians were still tribal horsemen, and the Egyptians never forgot it. In 405 BCE, at almost the same moment Artaxerxes II took the throne, Egypt rebelled under native Egyptian pharaohs. And unlike previous Egyptian rebellions, this one succeeded. For 60 years, 405 to 345 BCE, Egypt was essentially independent, ruled by a succession of native dynasties. The Persians attempted reconquest several times. Each expedition required enormous resources. Armies had to march across the Levant, ships had to be assembled, supplies had to be organized. Some attempts were defeated by Egyptian resistance, others by Greek mercenaries the Egyptians hired with their considerable wealth. The stubborn Egyptian independence demonstrated that the empire could no longer simply assume rebellious provinces could be quickly reduced. The Western satrapies began showing concerning independence. Wealthy, sophisticated, and distant from the central authority, satraps in Anatolia increasingly acted like kings themselves. They minted coins bearing their own images, maintained substantial armies, conducted semi-independent foreign relations with Greek city-states. Technically, they remained subject to the great king, but the relationship increasingly resembled alliances between sovereigns rather than hierarchical subordination. In the 360s, a major rebellion called the Great Satraps' Revolt saw several Western satraps simultaneously challenge royal authority. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it required major military effort and revealed how tenuous central control had become in distant provinces. Even after suppression, the Western satraps retained significant autonomy. The empire's structure, so carefully designed by Darius, was showing strain. Money became a problem in an unexpected way. The empire's wealth, legendary for generations, began to work against it. The royal treasuries held so much gold and silver, accumulated tribute from decades of prosperity, that enormous amounts of precious metals were effectively removed from circulation, hoarded in the treasuries at Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana. This actually constrained economic activity elsewhere, since there wasn't enough currency circulating for commerce to function efficiently. Meanwhile, Greek cities were developing sophisticated financial instruments, banking systems, credit arrangements, insurance mechanisms that made their economies more flexible despite having far less actual gold and silver. The Persians, enormously wealthy in theory, were becoming somewhat cash-poor in practice, at least outside the immediate vicinity of the royal treasuries. The military began to change in concerning ways. The immortals and other Persian core units remained effective, but increasingly the empire relied on Greek mercenaries for infantry. The Greeks were undeniably good, disciplined, well-armored, trained to fight in the phalanx formation that had proven effective against Persian cavalry and lighter infantry. But relying on mercenaries created vulnerabilities. They fought for pay, not loyalty. They could be hired by rebels as easily as by the king. And their presence implied that the empire couldn't generate sufficient quality infantry from its own populations. The navy faced similar issues. Persian naval power had always depended largely on Phoenician and Ionian Greek ships and sailors. As Greek cities became more restive and as Phoenicia's cities grew more independent-minded, the reliability of the fleet became questionable. Meanwhile, Greek cities like Athens were developing naval expertise and shipbuilding capacity that rivaled or exceeded what Phoenicia could provide. Court politics became increasingly Byzantine and dangerous. With vast wealth at stake and succession not always clear, ambitious officials and royal relatives engaged in elaborate intrigues. Artaxerxes II had to navigate between various factions, rewarding loyalty, punishing treachery, and constantly watching for threats from within his own household and administration. The harem, filled with wives and concubines from across the empire, became a political institution where alliances were formed and plots hatched. Eunuchs, castrated males who served in the royal household and could rise to high administrative positions, became increasingly influential. Unable to found dynasties themselves, they were seen as potentially more reliable than officials with sons to advance. But this also created a class of powerful officials outside the normal lines of loyalty and obligation. Some served faithfully for decades, Others pursued their own agendas, accumulated wealth and power, and became effectively independent centers of authority within the broader imperium. The royal road network, while still functional, wasn't being maintained as carefully as in earlier generations. Bridges deteriorated without repair. Way stations became run down. In some areas, bandits operated despite the supposedly secure roads. The nervous system of the empire was beginning to fail. Religious unity, such as it was, also became more complicated. Zoroastrianism was developing into a more rigid, codified system, with increasing emphasis on purity rules and proper ritual. But this made it less adaptable to the diverse religious landscape of the empire. Meanwhile, new religious ideas were circulating: Greek philosophy, mystery cults, evolving forms of Judaism that incorporated Persian apocalyptic thinking. The religious landscape was becoming more complex and less easily managed by simple tolerance. None of these problems were individually catastrophic. The empire had faced rebellions before and suppressed them. Egypt had been lost and recovered. The western satrapies could be brought back under control with sufficient force. The court had always been full of intrigue. The military could be reformed. The administration could be updated. But collectively, these issues suggested something more fundamental. The systems that had made the empire functional were wearing out. The initial brilliance of Cyrus's accommodation and Darius's organization was becoming routine, and routinization led to sclerosis. Officials followed procedures without understanding their purpose. The king's word still carried enormous weight, but it took longer to reach the provinces and was sometimes ignored when it did. The sense that Persian rule represented the pinnacle of civilization, that being part of the empire meant participating in something greater than oneself, was fading. Artaxerxes III, who ruled from 358 to 338 BCE, recognized these problems and attempted forceful solutions. He was determined to restore royal authority, to remind rebellious provinces of the costs of defiance. He led campaigns personally, showing energy and military skill. He finally reconquered Egypt in 345 BCE, after decades of independence, through a massive, well-organized invasion. He purged potentially disloyal officials, strengthened the central administration, and reasserted control over the western satrapies. For a moment, it seemed to work. The empire appeared to be recovering its strength and unity. But Artaxerxes III's methods were harsh, and they bred resentment. And his success lasted only until 338 BCE, when he was assassinated by a court official named Bagoas, a eunuch who had gained enormous power and decided to choose his own puppet king. This assassination, more than any external defeat, symbolized how far the empire had declined from Darius's vision. The king, who was supposed to be the representative of cosmic order, the chosen of Ahura Mazda, had been murdered by his own official. The court, which was supposed to be the center of the empire's administration, had become a nest of intrigue where power mattered more than legitimacy. Bagoas installed Artaxerxes III's youngest son as Artaxerxes IV, but the new king proved less malleable than expected. So Bagoas killed him too and elevated Darius III to the throne in 336 BCE. Darius III was a distant relative of the royal family, a compromise choice. He was competent and well-meaning, but he inherited an empire showing serious structural strain at the worst possible moment. Because while the Persians were struggling with internal challenges, to the west, in Macedonia, a brilliant young king named Alexander had just finished consolidating his power. And he was looking east with ambitious eyes. The cracks in the empire, visible to anyone who looked carefully, were about to split wide open. Picture Darius III in his palace at Susa, early in 334 BCE. He's been king for only 2 years, still learning to navigate the complexities of ruling the world's largest empire. Reports arrive of a Macedonian army crossing the Hellespont into Anatolia, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. The king who leads them is Alexander, son of Philip of Macedonia, barely 22 years old. This might not seem particularly alarming. The Greeks had been a source of minor irritation for 2 centuries, but they had never seriously threatened Persian power. The Macedonians were rough northerners, barely considered Greek by the sophisticated cities to their south. And this army, perhaps 35,000 to 40,000 soldiers, was tiny compared to the forces the empire could theoretically muster. The initial reaction at the Persian court was probably something like mild annoyance rather than panic. The first battle came at the Granicus River in May 334 BCE. The Persian forces were commanded by satraps of the western provinces, not by the king himself. This wasn't considered important enough for royal attention. The Persians, with perhaps 20,000 troops including substantial Greek mercenary infantry, took a strong defensive position on the far bank of the river. Alexander attacked immediately, leading his cavalry personally through the water and up the bank in what should have been a suicidal charge. But it worked. Alexander's combination of personal courage, tactical brilliance, and the superb training of his Macedonian and Greek forces overwhelmed the Persian position. The satraps were killed or fled. The Persian forces scattered. Alexander had won his first victory against the empire, and suddenly the western coast of Anatolia lay open to him. Still, this might have been recoverable. One lost battle, even against the king's representatives, didn't doom an empire that had weathered far. On paper, Darius's army should have won. It outnumbered Alexander's forces substantially. It included Persian and Median cavalry, Greek mercenary hoplites, and contingents from across the empire. The king himself was present, which should have inspired the troops and demonstrated royal commitment. But the battlefield terrain, constrained between mountains and sea, negated the Persian numerical advantage. And Alexander's army was simply better. More experienced, better trained, more cohesive, led by officers who had trained together for years under Philip and Alexander. The battle began with cavalry engagements on the flanks. Alexander, leading the elite companion cavalry personally, smashed through the Persian left and drove directly toward Darius's position in the center. The Persian king, watching this unstoppable force approaching, watching his guards cut down, seeing Alexander himself pressing toward him, did what seemed prudent at the moment. He turned his chariot and fled. His flight decided the battle. When the soldiers saw their king fleeing, they broke and ran too. The Persian army, which might have fought on, which might have used its numbers to envelop and destroy Alexander's smaller force, instead dissolved into panicked retreat. Thousands were killed in the pursuit. Darius's royal tent, his family, his treasury, all were captured. The great king of Persia, representative of Ahura Mazda's order on earth, had run from a 24-year-old Macedonian. The psychological impact of this defeat cannot be overstated. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Persian kings since Cyrus was shattered. If the great king himself would flee, what example did that set for his soldiers, his officials, his subjects? Alexander, meanwhile, gained enormous prestige. He had defeated the Persian king in personal combat, or close enough for propaganda purposes. He was the new Cyrus, the new world conqueror. After Issus, Alexander turned south along the Levantine coast rather than pursuing Darius into Mesopotamia. This strategic choice reveals Alexander's brilliance. He spent 332 and 331 BCE securing the Mediterranean coast, besieging Tyre for 7 months, conquering Egypt, cutting the Persian Empire off from the sea entirely. The Persian fleet, always dependent on Phoenician bases, became irrelevant without access to its home ports. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. He was crowned pharaoh in ancient ceremonies at Memphis. He founded Alexandria, which would become one of the ancient world's greatest cities. He visited the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, which supposedly proclaimed him the son of Zeus Ammonius. Whether he actually believed this divine parentage or simply used it as propaganda, it further enhanced his claim to be more than just another conqueror. Darius, meanwhile, was rebuilding. He gathered another army, larger than before, drawing on the empire's vast manpower reserves. He chose the battlefield carefully, the plains near Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where Persian cavalry could operate freely and numbers would matter. He prepared the ground, leveling it for his scythed chariots. He assembled forces from across the empire, Persian and Median cavalry, infantry from Bactria and Sogdiana, Indian troops and elephants, Scythian horse archers, whatever could be mustered. The Battle of Gaugamela in October 331 BCE was the empire's last real chance. Darius had perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 troops against Alexander's 40,000 to 50,000. The Persian position seemed strong. The king was present, the army was rested and prepared, and they held the ground of their choosing. But Alexander had perfected the tactical system his father Philip had developed. The combined arms coordination of heavy cavalry, pike-wielding phalanx infantry, and flexible light troops that could adapt to any situation. When battle was joined, Alexander again led his cavalry in a decisive charge, finding a gap in the Persian lines and driving through it toward Darius's position. And again, when Alexander's cavalry approached, Darius fled. This time, there was no excuse. The battle wasn't lost. Large portions of the Persian army were still fighting, still had the advantage. But the king's flight demoralized the troops, and the army broke again. Gaugamela wasn't just a defeat, it was the end of the Achaemenid dynasty's credibility as military power. After Gaugamela, the empire's heartland lay open. Alexander marched into Babylon, which surrendered without resistance. He took Susa, where the royal treasury held thousands of talents of gold and silver, wealth accumulated over 2 centuries of tribute. He captured Persepolis itself, taking its treasuries and eventually burning the palaces, whether accidentally during a drunken celebration or deliberately as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. The wealth Alexander seized from these captures was staggering. Ancient sources record figures that seem almost impossible: 50,000 talents of silver from Susa, 120,000 from Persepolis, more from Ecbatana and other centers. Even allowing for exaggeration, this represented a substantial fraction of the empire's accumulated wealth. Alexander used this treasure to pay his troops, fund his campaigns, and essentially destabilize the ancient world's economy by releasing enormous amounts of precious metals that had been hoarded for generations. Darius fled east with whatever forces remained loyal. Alexander pursued him through Media and into the eastern satrapies. In summer 330 BCE, near modern Mashhad, a group of Darius's own officials, led by Bessus, satrap of Bactria, assassinated him. They hoped to gain Alexander's favor, or perhaps to establish themselves as independent kings in the east. Instead, for ordinary people across the empire, the transition was probably less dramatic than the battles suggest. They paid taxes to new authorities but continued farming their land. They traded in markets that functioned much as before. They worshipped their gods in temples that mostly survived the conquest. The great upheaval affected primarily the elite, those whose positions, wealth, and lives were tied to the imperial system. But the psychological impact was profound. The Achaemenid Empire had existed for over 2 centuries. For most people alive in 330 BCE, it was the only political order they had ever known. Its collapse, so sudden and complete after seeming so permanent and invincible, must have been disorienting. The world's order, the cosmic Arda that Persian kings claimed to embody, had been shattered by a Macedonian youth barely out of his teens. And Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital, the stage where empire had been performed for generations, lay in ruins, its columns shattered, its treasuries looted, its reliefs blackened by fire. The place where Nowra celebrations had demonstrated imperial glory, where tribute processions had climbed the great staircase, where the king had sat elevated above the world's representatives. All of it was destroyed in a single night, whether deliberately or accidentally we'll never know for certain. The Achaemenid Empire, which had seemed to its inhabitants to be the final form of human political organization, the culmination of all previous civilizations, had fallen in less than a decade to an invader from the empire's periphery. Everything that had seemed permanent proved fragile. All the careful systems and structures had failed when tested by a truly formidable military challenge combined with internal weakness. The unraveling was complete. When did the Achaemenid Empire truly end? Was it when Darius III fled from Issus? When Alexander entered Babylon? When Persepolis burned? When Darius was murdered by his own officials? Or did it end years later, when the last Persian holdouts finally submitted to Macedonian rule? Perhaps it ended not in any single moment but in a series of breakings, each one fracturing the empire's foundation until the whole structure collapsed. Let's trace those fractures through the eyes of people who lived through them. In Babylon, an ancient city that had outlasted empire after empire. The news of Alexander's approach in 331 BCE sparked immediate calculations among the elite. The city's Persian satrap had to decide: resist and probably be destroyed, or surrender and perhaps preserve the city's wealth and autonomy. He chose surrender. When Alexander entered Babylon, he was welcomed with celebrations. The priests of Marduk presented him to the god, and Alexander, like Cyrus before him, accepted Babylonian religious legitimacy. For most Babylonians, this was just another change of management, the fifth or sixth empire to rule them, depending on how you counted. But for the Persian officials and their families, this was catastrophe. Some fled east with Darius. Others stayed and tried to negotiate positions under the new regime. Their children, raised to inherit imperial positions, suddenly faced an uncertain future. Their wealth, often in the form of land grants and positions that came with their official status, became precarious. Within a generation, the Persian aristocracy in Babylon would be absorbed into Alexander's system or would disappear. In Egypt, still resentful of its recent reconquest by Artaxerxes III, Alexander's arrival was genuinely welcomed. The Persian satrap was killed, not by Alexander but by his own Egyptian subjects. The temples that had been closed or penalized by harsh Persian rule were restored. Egyptian priests, who had maintained their status and knowledge through foreign rule after foreign rule, simply transferred their support to a new pharaoh. Egypt's break from Persian rule was probably the least traumatic of the empire's losses because the Egyptians had never truly accepted being Persian subjects. In Persepolis, the center of Persian identity, the breaking point came with fire. Whether Alexander ordered it burned or whether it was an accident during a celebration, the result was the same. The physical embodiment of Achaemenid glory was destroyed. When the wooden roofs caught fire, when the cedars imported from Lebanon burned, when the heat cracked the stone columns and blackened the carefully carved reliefs, something irreplaceable was lost. Imagine being a Persian noble, perhaps descended from one of the seven who helped Darius seize the throne 2 centuries earlier. Your family had participated in every Nowruz ceremony at Persepolis. Your ancestors were carved into the tribute processions on the staircases. Your identity was tied to this place and what it represented. And now it was rubble and ash, looted by foreign soldiers, its treasuries emptied, its significance destroyed. For such a person, the empire's end wasn't an abstract political event. It was Alexander gave him a royal funeral, sending his body back to Persepolis for burial in the traditional royal tombs. This gesture was more than magnanimity. It was Alexander claiming the role of legitimate successor rather than foreign conqueror. By honoring the dead king, Alexander positioned himself as the new great king, heir to Cyrus and Darius I, rather than destroyer of their empire. But what did the empire's end mean for ordinary people? For a farmer in Mesopotamia, life continued much as before. You still worked your land, still paid taxes, still took your produce to market. The officials collecting taxes might speak Greek or Macedonian now instead of Persian, but the actual burden probably didn't change much. The protection from banditry and invasion that empire provided was replaced by more empire, just under different management. For urban craftsmen and merchants, Alexander's conquest actually opened new opportunities. The enormous wealth he released from the royal treasuries stimulated the economy. His new cities, the many Alexandrias he founded across the conquered territories, created markets and trading hubs. The integration of the Persian Empire with the Greek world meant new trade routes, new customers, new goods flowing in both directions. But for the Persian priestly class, the Magi, the empire's end was profound spiritual crisis. They had maintained the sacred fires, preserved the religious traditions, understood themselves as guardians of cosmic order. Now the fire temples were abandoned or destroyed. The royal patronage that had supported them evaporated. The religious framework that made sense of the world, where the Persian king maintained order against chaos, had collapsed. How do you maintain cosmic order when the representative of that order has been defeated and killed? Some magi fled to remote regions where Persian traditions might survive. Others adapted, finding positions in the new order, maintaining what religious practices they could. Still others saw the conquest as a cosmic catastrophe, a victory of lies over truth, of darkness over light. These apocalyptic interpretations would influence later Zoroastrian theology, which increasingly emphasized eschatology, the belief that the world was moving toward a final battle between good and evil. The breaking point wasn't the same everywhere or for everyone. In some regions, it came suddenly and completely. In others, it came gradually. And in some places, it never fully came. Persian cultural forms, administrative practices, and traditions survived under Macedonian rule and would eventually resurface under later Iranian dynasties. Alexander himself contributed to this continuity by adopting Persian court ceremonies, wearing Persian royal dress, and incorporating Persian nobles into his administration. He married several Persian noblewomen, including Statira, daughter of Darius III. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian women. At the famous mass wedding at Susa in 324 BCE, he presided over the marriage of thousands of his soldiers to Persian wives. These weren't simply political marriages. Alexander genuinely seems to have wanted to create a fusion of Greek and Persian cultures, a new cosmopolitan civilization that would draw on the best of both traditions. His vision was of an empire that wouldn't simply replace Persian rule with Macedonian rule, but would create something new, something that transcended ethnic divisions. But this vision died with him. When Alexander died in Babylon in June 323 BCE, barely 32 years old, his empire immediately fragmented. His generals fought among themselves for decades, eventually dividing his conquests into separate kingdoms. Persia and Mesopotamia fell to Seleucus, founder of the Seleucid Empire. Egypt went to Ptolemy, Macedon and Greece to others. The brief moment when the entire Persian Empire might have been unified with the Greek world under a single brilliant conqueror ended almost as soon as it began. Yet even in breaking, even in defeat, the Achaemenid model influenced what came after. The Seleucids governed their territories using modified versions of the satrapy system. They maintained Susa and other Persian cities as capitals. They employed Persian administrators and adopted Persian bureaucratic practices. Alexander's successors, in trying to rule the territories he'd conquered, discovered why the Persians had developed the systems they had, because governing vast, diverse territories required exactly the kind of administrative sophistication the Achaemenids had developed. The breaking point, then, was both absolute and incomplete. The Achaemenid dynasty ended. No descendant of Cyrus or Darius would ever rule again. The political structure collapsed. The unified empire from Anatolia to India ceased to exist. The ceremonial centers were destroyed. Persepolis would never again host Nowruz celebrations with tribute from 23 provinces. But the idea of Persia, the memory of the empire, the cultural forms and administrative practices, these survived. They survived in the territories that had been Persian, in the peoples who had been Persian subjects, and in the conquerors who found they couldn't rule without borrowing from Persian precedents. For someone standing in the ruins of Persepolis in, say, 320 BCE, a decade after the conquest, the empire's end would have seemed total and permanent. The columns were shattered, the treasuries empty, the inscriptions blackened. The processions of tribute-bearers existed only as damaged reliefs, shadows of a vanished glory. The great hall where the king had sat elevated above the world's representatives was open to the sky, its cedar roof consumed by fire. And yet, even in those ruins, something persisted. The vision of empire that Cyrus had founded and Darius had systematized, the idea that diverse peoples could be governed through respect for local traditions combined with efficient central administration, the concept of the king as maintainer of cosmic order, these ideas didn't die with the Achaemenid dynasty. The Seleucid Empire, founded by Alexander's general Seleucus, controlled most of the former Achaemenid territory east of the Mediterranean. The Seleucids were Greek in language and culture, but they quickly realized they couldn't govern these territories without Persian cooperation. They retained Persian nobles in administrative positions, maintained Persian bureaucratic practices, and even supported Persian religious institutions when it served their interests. In the great cities Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana, life gradually returned to patterns that would have been recognizable to someone from the Achaemenid period. Markets functioned, temples operated, irrigation systems were maintained. The Khanate network still brought water from the mountains. Farmers still worked land their families had farmed for generations. The surface had changed. Greek had joined Aramaic as an administrative language. Greek soldiers garrisoned strategic points. Greek cities were founded, but underneath, much of the infrastructure and many of the practices remained Persian. The Zoroastrian priesthood, the Magi, proved remarkably resilient. Though they'd lost royal patronage and many temples had been destroyed or abandoned, they maintained their oral traditions. In remote regions, especially in Fars province where Persepolis lay, they continued tending sacred fires, teaching their traditions to new generations, preserving the hymns and rituals that formed the core of their religion. The Avesta, the holy texts, existed only in memory during this period. Priests memorized enormous amounts of material and passed it down through careful training. This oral preservation was crucial. Without written texts, the tradition had to live in human memory, maintained through constant repetition and teaching. The Magi became walking repositories of Persian culture, carrying forward not just religious practices but also historical memory, genealogies, and cultural knowledge. They kept alive the stories of Cyrus and Darius, of the empire's greatness, of Persian identity as something more than just another conquered people. Language proved to be another carrier of continuity. Middle Persian evolved from the Old Persian of the Achaemenid inscriptions, maintaining essential vocabulary and grammatical structures while adapting to changed circumstances. Even as Greek became the language of administration and high culture in the Seleucid Empire, Persian continued to be spoken in homes, markets, and villages across the Iranian plateau. Language carried memory, words for irrigation techniques, for social relationships, for religious concepts, all maintained cultural knowledge even when political power was gone. Art forms evolved but maintained continuity. The rock reliefs at places like Nakshi-Rostam, where Achaemenid kings were buried, served as reminders of past glory. Though no one was adding new reliefs, the old ones remained visible, showing the great kings in their power, receiving tribute, communing with Ahura Mazda. Later generations would look at these monuments and remember that Persians had once ruled the world. Persian nobility, or what remained of it, faced a choice: collaborate with the new rulers or maintain a kind of internal exile, withdrawing from public life while preserving their traditions privately. Many chose collaboration. They served the Seleucids as administrators, generals, or local governors, maintaining their wealth and status by adapting to new circumstances. But even these collaborators often maintained Persian cultural practices in their private lives, spoke Persian at home, celebrated Persian festivals, and married within Persian noble families. Others withdrew to their estates in Fars or other provinces, maintaining as much autonomy as the Seleucids would tolerate. These families became repositories of Persian tradition, maintaining genealogies that traced their descent back to Achaemenid times, preserving stories of ancestors who had served the great kings, keeping alive a sense of Persian identity distinct from the Hellenistic culture that dominated the urban centers. The common people maintained their lives as best they could under successive empires. The tax burden under the Seleucids was probably similar to what it had been under the Achaemenids, neither light nor crushing, just the steady drain of resources that farming populations paid to whoever controlled the cities and armies. But the Seleucids were more distant, less connected to local conditions, more focused on their constant wars with the Ptolemies in Egypt and various threats from the Mediterranean world. This created space for regional autonomy. Local leaders, tribal chiefs, city magistrates, temple administrators managed their communities with less interference from central authority than they'd experienced under the Achaemenids. This was both blessing and curse. More freedom but less protection. More autonomy but less access to imperial resources for projects like irrigation maintenance or road repair. In Bactria and the eastern regions, something remarkable happened. A Greek kingdom was established that gradually became more Persian than Greek. The Bactrian Greeks, cut off from the Mediterranean world by Seleucid territory and later by the Parthian Empire, intermarried with local populations, adopted Persian customs, and created a hybrid culture. Their coins show Greek kings with Greek inscriptions on one side and Persian or Indian iconography on the other. This was Hellenistic culture going native, being absorbed and transformed by the older civilizations it had conquered. Meanwhile, on the Iranian plateau's northeastern edge, a confederation of Iranian tribes called the Parnai began expanding. They were related to the ancient Scythians, semi-nomadic horsemen who spoke an Iranian language and worshipped Iranian gods. Around 247 BCE, under a leader named Xerxes, they conquered the region of Parthia, establishing what would become the Parthian Empire. The Parthians would eventually overthrow the Seleucids and reconquer most of the former Achaemenid territory. But that took time, over a century of gradual expansion. For now, they were just one more regional power among. By the 1st century BCE, the Parthians controlled territory from the Euphrates to eastern Iran, challenging Rome in the west and maintaining Persian cultural traditions throughout their empire. They defeated Roman armies, most famously at Carrhae in 53 BCE, where they annihilated Crassus's legions and captured Roman standards. A humiliation Rome would never forget. They proved that Iranian peoples could still build empires, could still field armies that terrified the world's other great powers. But even more important than the Parthians' military and political achievements was what they represented: the survival and revival of Persian civilization. The knowledge, traditions, practices, and identity that had been preserved through the dark decades after Alexander's conquest could now express themselves politically again. The sacred fires that the Magi had tended in obscurity could be supported by royal patronage. The administrative systems that had been maintained informally could become official again. The memory of being a great civilization rather than a conquered people could become reality. In the villages and cities of the Iranian plateau, life under the Parthians wasn't drastically different from life under the Seleucids. You still farmed, still traded, still paid taxes. But the psychological difference mattered. The rulers spoke your language, worshipped your gods, respected your traditions. The empire's orientation had shifted back from the Mediterranean world to the Iranian world. You were part of something that felt like yours again, not just subjects of foreign rulers. The Achaemenid monuments, especially Persepolis, took on new meaning during the Parthian period. The Parthians visited these ruins, added their own inscriptions, and used them as symbols of the glorious past they claimed to restore. The damaged reliefs showing tribute processions, the shattered columns of the Apadana, the inscriptions of Darius, all became proof that Iranians had once ruled an empire greater than Rome, greater than anything the Greeks had built alone. And the stories began to grow. In the absence of detailed written histories, most Achaemenid records were destroyed or lost. Oral traditions filled the gaps. Cyrus became a legendary figure, his actual accomplishments embellished with mythical elements. The Achaemenid kings were remembered as righteous rulers, champions of truth, maintainers of cosmic order. The reality of succession struggles, administrative failures, and eventual military defeat was overshadowed by the memory of glory. This mythologizing served a purpose. It provided the Parthians and later Iranian dynasties with a usable past, a foundation for claiming legitimacy, a narrative of Iranian greatness that could inspire resistance to foreign domination. Whether the stories were historically accurate mattered less than what they meant to people trying to understand themselves as part of a continuing civilization. By the early centuries CE, as the Parthian Empire declined and was replaced by the Sasanian Empire, 224 to 651 CE, the process of remembering and reconstructing Persian civilization reached its fullest expression. The Sasanians explicitly modeled themselves on the Achaemenids, calling their empire the Empire of Iranians, supporting Zoroastrianism as a state religion, building monuments that deliberately echoed Achaemenid forms, and commissioning texts that preserved and elaborated on Persian traditions. It was under the Sasanians that the Avesta was finally written down, preserving in written form the religious traditions the Magi had carried orally for 6 centuries. It was under the Sasanians that the great Persian epic, the Shahnameh, took shape, a vast poetic history mixing legend and history, preserving stories of ancient heroes and kings, creating a narrative of continuous Persian civilization stretching back to mythical times. What remained of ancient Persia, then, was not just physical ruins or scattered populations. What remained was a civilization's sense of itself, its cultural practices, its religious traditions, its language, its stories, and its conviction that it represented something permanent and valuable despite temporary political defeat. This intangible inheritance proved more durable than any physical monument, more powerful than any military force. The Achaemenid Empire fell in a decade, but Persian civilization survived for millennia, influencing everything that came after. In the Shahnameh and other Persian literary traditions, Cyrus becomes Quraysh, a legendary king of wisdom and justice. Darius becomes Darab, and his deeds are magnified and mythologized. The historical conflicts and administrative complexities of the actual empire are simplified into tales of heroic kings battling chaos and maintaining righteousness. These stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, moral instruction, cultural identity, and political legitimation for whoever ruled Iran at the time. The Jewish tradition preserved a unique memory of ancient Persia. The Hebrew Bible presents Cyrus as Yahweh's anointed one, the foreign king chosen by God to free the Jews from Babylonian captivity. The book of Isaiah calls him Shepherd and Messiah, extraordinary titles for a pagan king. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple under Persian patronage. Esther is set entirely in the Persian court, presenting a complex view of Persian power that's both threatening and ultimately benevolent. This positive Jewish memory of Persia is remarkable given that most peoples remembered their conquerors negatively. But the Achaemenids' religious tolerance and the decree allowing the return to Jerusalem created a bond that survived in Jewish tradition. Throughout the Middle Ages and into modernity, Jews in Persia often enjoyed better treatment than Jews in Christian Europe, partly because of this ancient relationship's remembered legacy. The early Christians inherited some of this tradition but added their own interpretations. The Magi who visited Jesus in Matthew's Gospel were understood to be Persian priests, representatives of ancient wisdom recognizing divine truth. Persian Zoroastrianism, with its dualistic theology and eschatological expectations, was sometimes seen as a pagan anticipation of Christian truth. The Persian Empire became part of the framework for understanding providential history, one of the great empires that prepared the world for Christianity. When Islam arose in the 7th century CE, it encountered Persia at a crucial moment. The Sasanian Empire, the last great pre-Islamic Iranian dynasty, was exhausted by constant warfare with Byzantium. The Arab conquests, driven by the new Islamic faith, overthrew the Sasanians with surprising speed. Iran was incorporated into the Islamic world, and Persian civilization faced perhaps its greatest challenge since Alexander. But again, Persian culture proved resilient. Within a few generations, Persians were contributing to Islamic civilization at the highest levels. Persian administrators helped organize the caliphate. Persian scholars translated Greek and Sanskrit works into Arabic, preserving and transmitting ancient knowledge. Persian poets and writers helped develop classical Persian literature using the Arabic alphabet but maintaining Persian language and sensibility. The memory of the Achaemenids became complicated in Islamic Iran. The pre-Islamic past was Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance before the revelation of Islam. Yet it was also a source of pride, proof that Iranians had built great civilizations. This tension was resolved through a kind of cultural compartmentalization. One could be a good Muslim while also celebrating the pre-Islamic Persian heritage. The Shahnameh, completed after Iran's Islamization, presents the pre-Islamic past in this way, heroic and glorious, but also needing the completion that Islam would provide. Medieval Islamic historians preserved information about the Achaemenids that might otherwise have been lost. They had access to Persian sources, both written and oral, that no longer survive. While their accounts mixed legend with history, they maintained awareness of the empire's existence and general outline of its rise and fall. Figures like Cyrus and Darius remained known, even if the details of their reigns became increasingly legendary. In medieval and early modern Europe, knowledge of ancient Persia came primarily from Greek and biblical sources. The Persians appeared in medieval literature and art as exotic others, sometimes as villains, representing Islam's threat to Christendom, sometimes as examples of ancient wisdom, sometimes simply as colorful elements in historical narratives. The three Magi, understood as Persian kings, became part of European Christmas traditions, giving ancient Persia an unexpected place in Christian iconography. The Enlightenment brought new interest in ancient Persia, driven partly by classical studies and partly by contemporary European encounters with Safavid Iran. Philosophers looking for alternatives to European political models sometimes idealized Persian governance. Montesquieu, while coining the term Oriental despotism, also recognized that Persian governance had been more sophisticated than simple tyranny. The ideal of religious tolerance, particularly Cyrus's decree, appealed to Enlightenment values. The 19th century saw ancient Persia become a subject of systematic archaeology and scholarship. European explorers and archaeologists began excavating Persepolis, Susa, and other sites. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 1840s suddenly made Achaemenid inscriptions readable for the first time in over 2,000 years. Scholars could read Darius's own account of his rise to power, could study administrative documents from Persepolis, could begin to understand the empire on its own terms rather than just through Greek filters. This archaeological work transformed understanding of ancient Persia. The Greeks, it turned out, had not always been accurate or fair. The Persians had been far more sophisticated, organized, and culturally rich than Western stereotypes suggested. The administrative tablets from Persepolis revealed a complex bureaucracy managing the empire's resources with remarkable precision. The art and architecture demonstrated aesthetic sophistication. The inscriptions showed religious and ethical thinking more complex than simple fire worship. For modern Iran, the Achaemenid legacy became central to national identity, especially under the Pahlavi dynasty, 1925 to 1979. Reza Shah and his son Muhammad Reza Shah deliberately connected their rule to the ancient Persian Empire. They used Achaemenid symbols, celebrated pre-Islamic history, and attempted to de-emphasize Iran's Islamic identity in favor of its Persian heritage. The 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire in 1971, held at Persepolis, was the most elaborate expression of this, an extravagant pageant connecting the modern Pahlavi state to Cyrus and Darius. The 1979 Islamic Revolution rejected this Pahlavi glorification of the pre-Islamic past, emphasizing Iran's Islamic identity instead. Yet even revolutionary Iran couldn't entirely abandon the Achaemenid legacy. Cyrus remained a national hero. Persepolis remained a source of pride. The tension between Islamic and Persian identity that had existed for centuries continued, with each side claiming to represent the authentic Iran. Today, ancient Persia lives in multiple ways. Scholars continue excavating sites, reading texts, and refining our understanding of how the empire actually functioned. In Iran, ordinary citizens visit Persepolis and other sites, connecting with their pre-Islamic heritage while remaining proudly Muslim. The Persian language, literature, and cultural traditions maintain unbroken continuity from ancient times. And globally, the Achaemenid Empire has become recognized as a crucial link in human civilization. The first true multi-ethnic empire, pioneers of religious tolerance, innovators in administration and governance. The legacy is also linguistic. Persian remained a major literary and administrative language long after the empire fell. For centuries, Persian was the language of culture across much of Asia, from the Ottoman Empire to Mughal India. Poetry written in Persian influenced literatures from Turkish to Urdu. Words from Old Persian entered languages across Eurasia. Paradise from Pyridiza, satrap from Zarapvan, magi from Magus, and dozens of others. Architectural influences spread through later Islamic architecture, the columned halls, the pavilions, the garden designs. Miniature painting in later Persian art drew on ancient traditions, maintaining visual conventions that originated in Achaemenid relief sculpture. The very concept of the garden as paradise, which influenced Islamic garden design from Spain to India, originated in Persian practice. Perhaps most importantly, the Achaemenid Empire provided a model of how diverse peoples could be governed together. The Roman Empire would borrow from this model. The Islamic caliphates would adapt it. Modern concepts of federalism, provincial autonomy within central authority, religious tolerance as state policy, all have precedence in Achaemenid practice. This doesn't mean the Persians invented these concepts or that later implementations were simply copies, but the example was there, proving that such governance was possible. The afterlife of ancient Persia is thus multiple and contradictory. A Greek enemy, a Jewish liberator, a Christian precursor, an Islamic predecessor, a source of national pride, an archaeological treasure, a historical puzzle, a civilization that influenced everything that came after. Memory, legend, scholarship, politics, and continued cultural practice all blend together to keep the Achaemenid Empire alive in ways that transcend its historical existence. For over 1,000 years, Persepolis lay in ruins, visited occasionally by travelers who marveled at the broken columns and weathered reliefs but had little sense of what they were seeing. Medieval and early modern visitors knew these were important ancient remains, but the details were lost. The cuneiform inscriptions were unreadable. The history was confused. The ruins were impressive but mute. This began to change in the 17th and 18th centuries, when European travelers started visiting Iran and documenting what they found. They drew the ruins, copied inscriptions they couldn't read, and brought back reports of ancient grandeur. These reports sparked European imagination but also confusion. Were these the remains of Solomon's kingdom? Some ancient Babylonian city? The exact identification remained uncertain. The breakthrough came in the 1830s and 1840s with the decipherment of cuneiform writing. The Behistun inscription, carved by Darius I on a cliff face in western Iran, proved to be the key. The inscription was in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, making it essentially a Rosetta Stone for cuneiform. In 1835, Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer and diplomat, began the dangerous work of copying this inscription from the cliff face hundreds of feet above the ground. Rawlinson and other scholars gradually deciphered Old Persian cuneiform, then used it to unlock the other cuneiform scripts. By the mid-1840s, scholars could read Darius's own account of how he seized power and suppressed rebellions. They could read the administrative tablets from Persepolis. Suddenly, the Achaemenid Empire could speak in its own voice rather than just through Greek historians. This was revolutionary. It was as if a civilization that had been silent for 2,000 years suddenly began telling its own story. And that story often contradicted or complicated what the Greeks had reported. Darius presented himself not as a usurper but as the legitimate restorer of royal authority. The administrative documents showed sophisticated bureaucracy rather than Oriental despotism. The royal inscriptions emphasized justice and truth rather than just military might. Archaeological excavation of Persepolis began systematically in the 1930s under the direction of Ernst Herzfeld and later Erich Schmidt, sponsored by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. These excavations revealed the full scale of the site, not just the monumental ceremonial buildings visible as ruins, but also administrative structures, treasuries, residential areas, and workshops. The Persepolis Fortification Archive and Treasury Archive, tens of thousands of clay tablets recording daily administrative activities, provided unprecedented detail about how the empire actually functioned. What surprised excavators was how well organized everything was. The administrative tablets showed careful record-keeping. Rations issued, distances traveled, supplies moved, workers paid. The architecture revealed sophisticated engineering, clever use of foundation platforms to level the site, advanced stone-cutting techniques, architectural elements that distributed weight efficiently. The artifacts demonstrated high craftsmanship, delicate gold work, elaborate stone carving, sophisticated glazed brick decoration. Excavations at Susa, conducted by French archaeologists, revealed similar sophistication. The palace complex showed how Persian architecture incorporated elements from across the empire: Egyptian-style columns, Babylonian glazed bricks, Greek stone carving techniques, while creating a distinctively Persian aesthetic. The administrative documents paralleled those from Persepolis, showing the same careful bureaucratic systems operating across the empire. But archaeological work also revealed the limitations of our knowledge. The Persians built primarily with mud brick, which doesn't survive well. Most residential buildings, most ordinary structures, have eroded away, leaving mainly the stone monuments. The wooden elements, roof beams, doors, furniture, burned or rotted, surviving only as impressions or charred fragments. The textiles, leather goods, and organic materials that filled daily life have mostly vanished. The written record is similarly fragmentary. The administrative tablets from Persepolis survived because they were fired hard when the palace burned. Fire preserved what was meant to be temporary record-keeping. But most official correspondence, literary works, and detailed histories were written on perishable materials and are lost. We can reconstruct administrative systems but know little about Persian literature, philosophy, or detailed historical narratives from their own perspective. The 20th century brought new interpretive challenges. Early archaeology often assumed that Persian culture was derivative, borrowing from Egypt, Babylon, and Greece without creating anything original. But as understanding deepened, scholars recognized that Persian art and architecture, while incorporating influences, created something distinctively new. The synthesis itself was the innovation, the creation of a cosmopolitan style that could represent a multi-ethnic empire. The Pahlavi dynasty's promotion of Achaemenid heritage made archaeological work in Iran both easier, it was well-funded and officially supported, and more complicated, as it became entangled with nationalist politics. The 1971 celebration at Persepolis, while generating international attention, also sparked criticism from Iranians who saw it as the Shah's vanity project rather than genuine historical commemoration. After the 1979 revolution, Iranian archaeology faced new challenges. The Islamic Republic initially downplayed the pre-Islamic past, though this softened over time. International cooperation became more difficult due to political tensions. Some sites suffered damage during the Iran-Iraq War. Yet Iranian archaeologists continued their work, and international collaboration eventually resumed, bringing new technologies and methods to bear on ancient questions. Modern interpretation has become more nuanced and complex. Scholars now recognize that the Achaemenid Empire can't be understood through simple categories like despotic or tolerant. It was both and neither, a sophisticated system that combined centralized authority with remarkable flexibility, that could be brutal in suppressing rebellion but also accommodating of local traditions, that extracted substantial tribute but also provided real benefits of order and infrastructure. The question of Persian tolerance has been particularly debated. Was the policy of respecting local religions and customs genuine ethical commitment or cynical pragmatism? Probably both, and the question itself might be anachronistic. The Persians might not have distinguished between practical effectiveness and ethical behavior in the way modern thought does. What worked to maintain order was, by definition, right, because it maintained Arda, cosmic order. The economic history has been substantially revised. Early scholars assumed the Persian Empire was economically static, but analysis of the administrative tablets and archaeological evidence shows a dynamic economy with substantial trade, sophisticated credit systems, and agricultural innovation. The Khanate systems, the royal road network, the standardization of currency, these weren't just administrative tools but economic infrastructure that facilitated commerce across unprecedented distances. Gender relations are being reevaluated. The administrative tablets show women receiving wages, supervising workers, owning property, and traveling on official business. While Persian society was clearly patriarchal, elite women seem to have had more economic agency than Greek women, contrary to the Greek stereotype of Persian women as powerless harem inhabitants. Recent scholarship is exploring how gender, class, and ethnicity intersected in complex ways across the empire. The environmental impact of the empire is another new research area. Managing agriculture across diverse ecological zones, from Nile marshes to Iranian plateaus to Central Asian oases, required sophisticated understanding of different environments. The Khanate systems show advanced hydraulic engineering. But there's also evidence of environmental degradation, deforestation, soil erosion, salinization from irrigation, showing that even ancient empires could strain ecological systems. DNA analysis is providing new insights into population movements and ethnic mixing. The empire's cosmopolitan character wasn't just cultural but biological. People moved around the empire, intermarried, and created mixed populations in ways that archaeological and textual evidence alone can't fully reveal. This confirms the picture of the empire as genuinely multi-ethnic rather than simply Persians ruling over subject peoples. Digital humanities approaches are opening new research possibilities. Comprehensive databases of administrative tablets allow pattern recognition across thousands of documents. 3D modeling reconstructs destroyed architecture. Satellite imagery reveals ancient road networks and settlement patterns. Computational linguistics analyzes the evolution of Persian and related languages. Yet mysteries remain. We still don't know exactly how Zoroastrianism developed during the Achaemenid period, when it was codified, how much religious variation existed, how theology related to practice. We're unclear about succession rules and internal power dynamics within the royal family. We don't fully understand the relationship between the Persian elite and provincial elites, how power was actually negotiated rather than just theoretically organized. The archaeological record is also biased toward the elite and ceremonial. We know much about palaces and monuments, less about how ordinary people lived. We understand taxation systems better than everyday economic activity. We can reconstruct court ceremonies but know little about popular religion and culture. Every excavation, every translated text, every new analytical technique fills in gaps, but also reveals how much remains unknown. Modern interpretation must also navigate political sensitivities. The Achaemenid Empire remains relevant to contemporary politics, debates about Iranian national identity, about the relationship between Persian and other Iranian ethnic groups, about Islam's role in Iranian culture. Archaeological findings and historical interpretations can become entangled in these contemporary concerns, making dispassionate scholarship challenging. Yet, despite these complications, our understanding of ancient Persia is incomparably richer than it was 2 centuries ago. We can read Darius's own words, examine the pay records of workers who built Persepolis, trace trade routes through archaeological finds, reconstruct ancient agriculture through archaeobotany, and analyze the empire's administration through thousands of preserved documents. The silent ruins have become articulate, the forgotten empire has been rediscovered, and ancient Persia is being understood increasingly on its own terms rather than just through the lens of its Greek enemies or later mythologies. Sometimes history speaks to us not just as a record of what happened, but as a mirror reflecting eternal human challenges. The story of ancient Persia, from tribal confederation to world empire to sudden collapse, contains patterns and meanings that transcend its specific time and place. At its heart, the Achaemenid story is about the problem of organizing diversity. How do you unite peoples who speak different languages, worship different gods, follow different customs, and have conflicting interests? Cyrus and Darius found an answer. Respect local traditions while maintaining central control. Collect tribute but provide security and infrastructure. Allow autonomy in daily life but demand submission in imperial politics. This solution worked remarkably well for 2 centuries, suggesting something profound about human social organization. The genius was understanding that uniformity isn't necessary for unity. The Persians never tried to make Egyptians into Persians, never insisted that Babylonians abandon their gods, never required Greeks to adopt Iranian customs. Instead, they created an overarching framework flexible enough to accommodate profound difference. This required remarkable sophistication, understanding when to enforce uniformity in taxation, in military service, and when to allow variation in religion, in law, in culture. This lesson resonates today. Modern multi-ethnic states face similar challenges. How to maintain national unity while respecting diversity, how to balance centralized authority with local autonomy, how to collect taxes fairly across regions with different economies. The Achaemenid model, imperfect as it was, shows that such balancing is possible, but it requires constant attention, sophisticated administration, and willingness to adapt to local conditions. The empire also reveals the power and limits of tolerance. Persian religious tolerance was real. Subject peoples genuinely could worship their own gods without persecution. But it was also limited and strategic. The Persians tolerated other religions partly because it was impractical to do otherwise, partly because it made governance easier. They didn't value religious diversity in the modern pluralistic sense. They simply recognized that imposing religious uniformity across such vast territory was impossible and unnecessary. This suggests something about the nature of tolerance itself. Perhaps true tolerance doesn't require believing all beliefs are equally valid. It might only require recognizing that people will believe different things and that attempting to force uniformity is more costly than allowing diversity. This pragmatic tolerance, while less philosophically pure than principled pluralism, might actually be more stable because it's based on practical calculation rather than ideological commitment. The empire's collapse also teaches important lessons. Despite centuries of stability, despite sophisticated systems and accumulated wealth, despite military power and administrative competence, the empire fell in less than a decade to a force it should have been able to defeat. This wasn't inevitable. With better leadership, different choices, more luck, the Achaemenids might have defeated Alexander. But their defeat revealed how fragile even powerful empires are when challenged by a combination of external threat and internal weakness. The vulnerability came partly from the empire's very success. 2 centuries of stability bred complacency. The wealth accumulated in royal treasuries was economically sterile, hoarded rather than invested. The military relied increasingly on mercenaries because the ruling class had become more interested in administration than warfare. The provinces, prosperous and peaceful, had little incentive to defend a system that primarily benefited the imperial center. Success contained the seeds of decline. This pattern recurs throughout history. Empires become victims of their own success. The very peace and prosperity they create undermines the martial virtues and social cohesion that made them powerful initially. The solution to this dilemma isn't obvious. You can't maintain permanent crisis to keep people alert and united. You can't prevent wealth accumulation to avoid complacency. Perhaps the lesson is simply that no political order lasts forever, that all empires eventually decline, and that the best we can hope for is graceful adaptation rather than catastrophic collapse. The speed of the collapse is especially instructive. The Achaemenid Empire didn't gradually fade. It was destroyed in a few decisive battles by an enemy that was numerically inferior. This suggests that empires, despite appearing solid and permanent, are actually quite brittle. They depend on perception of invincibility, on the belief that resistance is futile. Once that perception is shattered, as it was when Darius fled from Issus, collapse can come quickly as subject peoples see an opportunity and former loyalists calculate that the empire has no future. Modern states aren't necessarily more stable. They too depend on perceptions of legitimacy and effectiveness. They too can suffer rapid collapse if those perceptions shift dramatically. The Soviet Union's sudden dissolution parallels the Achaemenid collapse in some ways. A seemingly powerful empire that disappeared in a few years once people stopped believing in its permanence. The empire's story also illuminates the relationship between power and culture. Persian military and political power eventually faded, but Persian culture influenced successor civilizations for centuries. The Parthians and Sasanians were culturally Persian even though they weren't Achaemenid. Islamic Iran remained distinctively Persian despite religious transformation. Modern Iran still looks back to Cyrus and Darius as cultural ancestors. This suggests that cultural influence can outlast political power, that what civilizations create culturally often matters more in the long run than what they conquer militarily. Yet we should be careful about romanticizing this. Cultural continuity doesn't mean the people who carried that culture lived well or that their traditions weren't transformed beyond recognition. The farmers who worked Iranian fields under the Achaemenids, Parthians, Sasanians, Islamic caliphates, and modern states lived hard lives under all of them. Cultural continuity meant something mainly to elites who could afford to care about such things. The role of individuals in history is another theme the Persian story illuminates. Cyrus's genius created the empire. Darius's administrative sophistication sustained it. Alexander's brilliance destroyed it. Would the empire have existed without Cyrus? Would it have lasted 2 centuries without Darius? Would it have fallen so quickly without Alexander? These aren't just counterfactual games. They're questions about whether history is shaped primarily by individuals or by larger forces beyond individual control. The answer seems to be both. Individuals matter. Cyrus's particular combination of military skill, political genius, and cultural sensitivity was unusual, and someone different might have created a very different empire or no empire at all. But individuals operate within constraints. Cyrus succeeded partly because circumstances favored Iranian expansion, Median weakness, Babylonian unpopularity, Greek disunity. Alexander succeeded partly because the Achaemenid system had weaknesses he could exploit. Great individuals aren't independent variables in history. They're people whose particular talents matched their historical moment's needs or opportunities. The Persian emphasis on truth, arda, offers another profound theme. For the Persians, truth wasn't just factual accuracy. It was cosmic order, the proper functioning of everything according to its nature. Lies weren't just false statements. They were violations of order, manifestations of chaos and evil. This connected moral behavior to metaphysical reality in a way modern thought often doesn't. This concept might seem alien, but perhaps it captures something important. When we lie, when we act dishonestly, When we betray trust, we do undermine social order in small ways. Scale that up across a society, and dishonesty really does create chaos. Corruption makes governance ineffective, lies undermine trust, deception prevents cooperation. The Persian intuition that truth and order are fundamentally connected might be less primitive than it initially seems. Finally, the story raises questions about what civilization means and what survives. Persepolis burned, the dynasty ended, the empire collapsed. But can its systems still water Iranian fields? Persian language and literature continue. Architectural and artistic traditions influence later work. Administrative practices pioneered by the Achaemenids were adopted by successor states. Cultural forms and social practices persist across political discontinuity. This suggests that civilization isn't primarily about states and empires, but about the accumulated knowledge, practices, and cultural forms that peoples develop and pass down. Political structures come and go, but the deeper civilizational substrate, language, technology, social norms, cultural traditions, persists and evolves. The Achaemenid Empire fell, but Persian civilization survived because it was embedded in millions of people's daily lives, not just in imperial institutions. These patterns and meanings don't provide simple lessons or easy answers. History is too complex for that. But they offer perspectives for thinking about enduring human challenges. How do we organize diverse peoples fairly? What does tolerance really mean? Why do powerful institutions suddenly collapse? What role do individuals play in history? How do we balance success with the values that created success? What actually survives when political orders change? Ancient Persia doesn't answer these questions definitively, but it provides a rich case study for thinking about them. And perhaps that's the deepest value of historical study, not learning specific lessons to apply directly, but developing wisdom about human possibilities and limitations, about patterns that recur across different contexts, about the complex interplay between intention and accident, structure and agency, continuity and change that makes history something more than just one thing after another. The sun sets over the ruins of Persepolis much as it did 2,500 years ago, when the great halls stood intact and tribute processions climbed the ceremonial staircases. The light catches the weathered stone, making the ancient reliefs briefly visible before shadow claims them. The columns that still stand, perhaps a third of what once existed, cast long shadows across rubble and reconstruction. Tourists photograph, archaeologists measure, and Iranian families picnic among their ancestors' monuments, connecting past to present in ways both profound and ordinary. What we've traced together is more than just the story of an empire's rise and fall. It's a meditation on human ambition and limitation, on what we build and what time destroys, on memory and forgetting, on the strange persistence of some things and the fragility of others. The Persians believed they were building permanent order, creating structures that would last forever because they reflected cosmic truth. They were both right and wrong. The empire lasted barely 2 centuries, a blink in civilizational time. The dynasty ended completely, its last king murdered by his own officials. The monuments were destroyed or left to erode. The sophisticated administrative systems disappeared when there was no longer a center to maintain them. Yet something essential survived. The language evolved but remained recognizably Persian. The cultural traditions adapted but continued. The religious impulses transformed but persisted. The memory of greatness, however mythologized, never disappeared. And the influence spread far beyond Iran, affecting how empires were organized, how diversity was managed, how power presented itself, how gardens were designed, how poetry was written, even which words we use in modern languages. This paradox of endings that aren't quite endings, of destruction that doesn't completely destroy, of death that somehow leads to resurrection, might be the story's deepest truth. Civilizations don't simply end when their political structures collapse. They continue in the people who carry their traditions forward, in the practices that seem ordinary because they've been done the same way for centuries, in the stories told around fires and dinner tables, in the words we speak without remembering where they came from. When we stand among Persepolis's ruins today, we're standing in multiple times simultaneously. There's the archaeological past, carefully measured and documented, understood through excavation and analysis. There's the mythological past, preserved in Persian literature and oral tradition, mixing history and legend into something more emotionally than factually true. There's the political past, invoked by various regimes to legitimize their rule. And there's the lived past, carried forward by ordinary people whose ancestors worked these fields, traveled these roads, worshipped at these altars. All these pasts coexist, none completely accurate, none completely false, each serving different needs and revealing different truths. The academic historian, the traditional storyteller, the nationalist politician, and the farmer whose family has lived in Fars for generations. All have claims on this history. All see something real in these ruins, even when they see different things. What should we take away from this long story? Not simple lessons, history rarely provides those, but perhaps some thoughts worth carrying forward. That organizing diverse peoples fairly is possible but requires sophisticated thinking about when to insist on uniformity and when to accommodate difference. That tolerance can be practiced for pragmatic reasons and still be real and valuable. That power, however great, is never permanent, and what seems invincible today may collapse tomorrow. That individuals matter but always within constraints they didn't create and can't fully control. That civilization is deeper and more durable than politics, embedded in daily practices and cultural forms more than in states and empires. And perhaps this, that what we build, however carefully, will eventually fall, but the meaning it carried, the knowledge it generated, the beauty it created, these can persist in unexpected forms, influencing peoples we never met, solving problems we never anticipated, inspiring futures we couldn't imagine. The Persians who built Persepolis couldn't have conceived of tourists with cameras, archaeologists with ground-penetrating radar, or scholars reading their administrative tablets 2.5 millennia later. They couldn't have imagined Persian literature flourishing after Islam, or Iranian scientists contributing to modern knowledge, or their language spoken by tens of millions. They built for immortality in their own terms, eternal dynasty, permanent empire, cosmic order maintained forever, and failed completely at that. Yet they achieved a different kind of immortality they never intended. This might be the most human aspect of their story. We build monuments to last forever, and they crumble. We create empires to endure for all time, and they collapse. We imagine our ways of life will continue unchanged, and everything transforms. Yet something persists, not what we intended to preserve, but something nonetheless. The wheat farmer in modern Fars using irrigation techniques refined over millennia is carrying forward Achaemenid knowledge, though he's probably never heard of Darius. The Persian poet writing in forms developed under Islamic influence but with sensibilities shaped by pre-Islamic traditions embodies continuity she might not consciously recognize. If there's comfort in this story, it's not in the success or failure of empires, the rise or fall of dynasties, the victories or defeats in battle. Those matter to the people living through them, profoundly, painfully, sometimes fatally. But across centuries, what seems to matter more is the quieter persistence. The knowledge that survives, the beauty that inspires, the practices that prove useful enough to be maintained, the stories that speak to something in human experience that transcends their original context. And if there's warning in this story, it's about the brittleness of confidence, the danger of assuming permanence, the risk of believing your own propaganda about invincibility. The Achaemenids thought they'd solved the problem of empire, created structures that would last. They were sophisticated enough that their confidence wasn't entirely hubris. Their systems worked remarkably well for 2 centuries. But confidence led to complacency. Success bred the vulnerabilities that made sudden collapse possible. Every powerful institution, every successful civilization, every confident empire should remember this. What works today might not work tomorrow. What seems invincible is probably more fragile than it appears. The tribute bearers climbing the stairs at Persepolis, the royal treasury overflowing with accumulated wealth, the organized provinces sending reports along the royal road. All of it looked permanent until suddenly it wasn't. Yet remembering fragility shouldn't lead to paralysis or nihilism. The Persians were right to try building something enduring, right to work toward organizing the world more fairly, right to attempt creating systems that could govern diverse peoples justly. That they ultimately failed doesn't make the attempt worthless. Those 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity mattered to the millions who lived under them. The innovations in administration, architecture, and culture mattered and influenced everything that came after. The attempt to rule through tolerance rather than just terror mattered, even if it was imperfect and eventually unsuccessful. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about how we hold our commitments. We should build carefully, rule justly, create beauty, organize effectively, and work toward lasting achievement, as if what we create will endure forever. And simultaneously, we should hold all of it lightly, knowing that impermanence is the only permanence, that every empire falls, that what we create will be transformed beyond recognition by peoples we'll never meet for purposes we never imagined. This double consciousness, building for eternity while knowing nothing is eternal, caring deeply while holding lightly, working seriously while maintaining perspective, is difficult to sustain. But the ruins at Persepolis model it for us. The stones remain, weathered but present, speaking of ambition and achievement and eventual failure. They don't need to stand intact to teach. The broken columns are more eloquent than whole ones might be, because they show both the glory of what was built and the inevitability of its decay. For you, friend, listening to this story wherever you are in the world, whatever time has brought you here, consider what connections you might have to this ancient empire. If you're Iranian, the connection is direct. These are literally your ancestors, and their cultural legacy lives in your language, your traditions, your sense of identity. If you're Jewish, there's a remembered relationship of rescue and patronage. If you're from anywhere touched by Persian influence, which includes vast territories from Turkey through Central Asia to India, there are cultural threads connecting you to these ancient Iranians. But even if you have no direct connection, the story speaks to universal human experiences. The dream of building something that will last. The challenge of organizing diverse people fairly. The tension between power and justice. The relationship between success and complacency. The brittleness of seemingly solid institutions. The persistence of culture across political discontinuity. These aren't Persian issues, they're human issues playing out in Persian context. As I mentioned at the beginning, this story matters not just as history but as meditation on what it means to build civilizations, to exercise power, to create meaning, and to face inevitable change. The Achaemenids were neither uniquely virtuous nor uniquely evil. They were humans attempting something ambitious, succeeding partially, and ultimately failing. Their particular success and failure teach us something about the possibilities and limits of human social organization. The fire temples that burned across the empire have mostly disappeared, but fire remains sacred to Zoroastrians who maintain ancient traditions. The Khanate systems that brought water to dry lands still function in some places, though many have fallen into disrepair. The royal road is gone, but modern highways roughly follow its route. The administrative techniques pioneered by Persian bureaucrats influenced all successor empires. The words borrowed from Persian continue circulating in dozens of languages. The gardens that embodied paradise on earth inspire designers even now. And Persepolis, though ruined, still stands on its terrace, still visible from miles away, still climbing toward the sky on columns that have outlasted the empire they represented. On spring mornings, when the light is right, you can almost see it as it was. The processions climbing the stairs, the delegations in their distinctive costumes, the king seated elevated in the Apadana, receiving tribute from the corners of the earth. Then the light shifts, and you see it as it is. Stones and rubble archaeological site, UNESCO World Heritage location, place of pilgrimage for those seeking connection to a vanished grandeur. Both visions are real. Both matter. The glory that was and the ruin that remains. Together they tell the complete story. Not a tragedy because the civilization survived its empire. Not a triumph because the empire fell. Something more complex and true. The story of human beings building ambitiously, achieving significantly, failing inevitably, and influencing the future in ways they never anticipated. So as you go forward from this story, carry with you not just facts and dates, though those matter, but the feeling of standing in those ruins, in that double time, seeing both what was and what is. Carry forward the paradox of building carefully while holding lightly, of caring deeply while maintaining perspective, of honoring the past while knowing it cannot and should not be recreated unchanged. The Achaemenid Empire is gone. Ancient Persia is finished. The great kings will never again sit in the Apadana receiving tribute from 23 provinces. But Persian civilization continues, transformed and transforming, carrying forward threads that connect modern peoples to ancient Iranians, maintaining cultural practices refined over millennia, speaking a language that evolved from what Cyrus and Darius spoke, telling stories that blend history and mythology into something that nourishes identity and meaning. And we, studying them across the gulf of 2.5 millennia, learn something about ourselves, about our own ambitions and limitations, about what we might build and what time will do to it, about memory and forgetting, permanence and change, power and vulnerability. The ancient Persians are our teachers not because they were perfect, but because they were ambitious, sophisticated, and ultimately as fragile as we are. Their story is our story, told in a different time and place, but recognizably human in all its glory and failure. The sun has set on Persepolis now. The shadows have claimed the ruins. But somewhere in Iran, a child is learning Persian poetry that carries ancient rhythms. Somewhere a farmer is checking a Achaemenid system maintaining water flows perfected centuries ago. Somewhere a scholar is reading another administrative tablet, adding one more detail to our understanding. Somewhere someone is telling this story again, differently, but recognizably the same story it's always been. Thank you for traveling with me through this long history, through the rise and fall and persistence of ancient Persia. May you find in it whatever you need: knowledge, perspective, inspiration, warning, or simply the satisfaction of understanding something complex about human civilization. And may you carry forward, in whatever way makes sense for you, some thread of this ancient story into your own life and future. Rest well, friend. And remember, what seems permanent rarely is, but what seems lost often persists in unexpected forms. The empires fall, but the stories continue, generation after generation, speaking across time about who we are and what we attempt and how we endure. Good night.